Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Moon's Tears in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 71, Icht. X. Listen Ichigo, I know you are worried about Ganju and me, but we need to be in the 12th. We can't sit back and watch as you and Kyan risk your lives along with every other Shinigami to defend Soul Society against the single biggest threat since it happened the first time. Here we can serve as your eyes and keep watch over the 12th and all the very important seals and the like going on here. Besides, we're not helpless Ichigo, you know Ganju's been training and I have more than a few tricks up my sleeve. Kyokaku finished, sounding both exasperated and knowing in the way only an older sibling could manage, even when talking about the potential risk of death. Ichigo sighed and pulled the Denrai Shinki away from his face for a moment as his eyes searched the hall in front of him. He wanted to protect his family, keep them out of harm's way, but he knew Kyokaku and he knew Ganju. Both were too stubborn to sit the war out and watch from the sidelines, and Ichigo knew if they weren't in the 12th then they sure as hell would find a way onto the battlefield. It still sat uneasily in his chest, the thought of stumbling upon their corpses together, except knowing them for a lifetime, their quirks, their favorite foods, and everything in between. Besides Ichigo, your Yuki's little brother will be here and I know you don't want him on the battlefield. Kyokaku added, likely knowing that Ichigo had only needed another reason, something else to ease his conscience. Ichigo ran a hand through his hair and muffled another sigh, thinking fondly for a moment of his siblings. Kyokaku lit up like a firework, Ganju's gentle nature, and Kyan's overbearing enthusiasm, and responded, "All right, please stay safe." The unspoken words lingered over the line for a moment before Kyokaku chuckled, the sound familiar and comforting. After a second of silence where 1,000 words lingered unspoken, she replied, "You as well, Ichi." Then the line cut out and Ichigo was left alone in the hallway. The orange-haired Shinigami leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment, taking a second to inhale and ignore the way his instincts bristled like a feral feline and the way his Reisu danced across his skin like an invisible itch. Zanjutsu's presence reached out for Ichigo's, wrapping around him in a silent promise that settled the fear crawling into his throat and reignited some of the warmth that had seemed to drift away as the days drew closer. Turning from the wall, Ichigo entered the Suteiko's office once more, the long room familiar to Ichigo with all its scrolls, the wide windows displaying the might of Soul Society, now near a ghost town in the pale afternoon light, and the Suteiko's broad desk. The old man was seated there sipping at a cup of tea as he read over the recent reconnaissance reports and the reports detailing the successful evacuation of the Rungokai districts. Kojiro was standing behind the old man on the left, one hand resting on the pommel of his elegant Zanpakuto even as he studied the walls with eyes elsewhere. With a whisper across the paved floor, Ichigo stood behind the Suteiko on the right, let his eyes sweep over their surroundings once more, lingering on the shadows for only a brief moment. The past few days had been filled with a seeping tension, the kind that buzzed just out of sight but steadily grew louder, filling every interaction, every breath, every morning waking up and wondering if this would be the day, saying goodbye to your loved ones as if it would be the last time. In some ways, it made Ichigo wish the Quincy would attack already, even as a thick dread seemed to fill the air around Ichigo as if he was drowning, each breath precariously tipping on his last. They had prepared countless meetings accompanied by coffee and video calls to 2 different dimensions, training with fervor to be better to work together, contacting the Royal Guard, and looking to the horizon. But in the end, it felt like nothing could prepare them enough. Ichigo shifted slightly and glanced over to Kojiro. The lieutenant's gaze was on the Suteiko, something hard there, strong like the earth itself in its undivided loyalty, and sat in the same mournful sort of way. The elder gentleman, as if sensing Ichigo's gaze, looked up and his lips quirked into the shadow of a smile accompanied by a nod, and Ichigo repeated the motion. Being a lieutenant under the Suteiko had been something close to cathartic, even for the short time it lasted. It had allowed Ichigo to step back, to talk with Kojiro about America, to drink tea with the Suteiko and debate ideology. The orange-haired lieutenant shifted out of his musings as his senses caught a wave of Reisu, building like the moment before a glacier crumbled beneath the icy sea. It held the same catastrophic nature. At the same moment, the Denrai Shinki in Ichigo's Shiakusho began to chime, a quiet sound that was far less obtuse than Kisuke's jaunty tune, which Ichigo knew the man had chosen to annoy everyone. Flicking the communication device out, Ichigo opened the screen and a hologram appeared displaying Tashiro's youthful features. In the background stood Haribel, a fierce frown accompanying both figures even as the video feed wavered and reoriented itself. Ichigo, the Quincy have entered Hueco Mundo. I report 8 Sternritter and a full force of Quincy. Currently, the Hollows are engaging the Quincy, and we are preparing for a full frontal assault. Toshiro stated in a brisk tone even as he glanced back to Haribel to confirm the information. Ichigo nodded, a grim line forming across his features as he furrowed his brow and mentally calculated how many competent fighters they had stationed in Hueco Mundo. Running a hand through his hair, Ichigo prayed it was none of the more overpowered Sternritter such as the Miracle and responded, "Copy that. When possible please send detail of each Sternritter to the 12th so we can tally them off. Also, make sure you activate Kisuke's invention and don't get cocky. Best of luck Toshiro and don't die." The young captain nodded, determination stealing his features. He glanced once at Ichigo, something challenging there telling Ichigo the same advice before he clicked the end call button and the holographic disappeared. A second later, the chime began again and Ichigo answered once more. This time Tessai appeared. Uryu and Hinta stood in the background holding onto their weapons as the Kido master said, reporting 1 Sternritter, in Karakura. Masake, Ryukin, and Ishine are confronting him on the outskirts of town. The twins and their friends have set up the stabilizing seals. Ichigo ignored the way his heart jolted in his chest as he thought of his family confronting one of the Sternritter, of what could happen to Yuzu and Karen if their parents didn't make it through the battle, of the destruction one Sternritter could wreak in the mortal realm. He wanted to question why the Sternritter was even in Karakura, but he knew Waiwak would have sensed the Quincy there, and the man left no stones uncovered. If they hadn't joined him they were against him. Copy that. Please keep the 12th posted on any updates and don't forget that if Ishine uses his Bankai he needs Kisuke's infusion. The orange-haired Shinigami responded, wincing slightly as the Reisu that seemed to suck the very air dry drew closer. Tessai nodded, eyes dark behind the glasses perched on the bridge of his nose before the call disconnected. Straightening, Ichigo glanced to the Suteiko who was still filling out reports, though there was a slowness to the movement that suggested the old man had also recognized the incoming Reisu. Opening the Denrai Shinki, Ichigo sent out a Soul Society-wide message alerting the Shinigami of the incoming attack and to assume their posts. A minute later Anohana sent a message that one of the particularly stupid Sternritter had attacked the 4th, the death dealing if she was correct, and that she was dealing with him. Ichigo replied, wishing the woman luck along with a farewell, and forwarded the message to the 12th before he tucked the communication device away. They appeared suddenly and as if the whisper of a voice long forgotten. Masked and silent they stood there at the end of the office even as Reisu exploded into being around them. Slowly Ichigo began to loosen the seal binding his power as Zanjitsu Asen's presence hummed mournfully for a moment before Ichigo could sense Shiro beating some sense into the older spirit. Yamamoto stood from his chair and addressed the Sternritter, questioning their identity and presence. It was all a cautious game of waiting as the silence between them stretched and stretched like a rope bridge suspected over a chasm. The small contingent of Sternritter parted and Waiwak stepped forward calm and collected. All-knowing eyes studied the Suteiko and the 2 lieutenants with a gruesome smile that had haunted many of Ichigo's nights. The Quincy King nodded and the Sternritter dispersed in a flicker of Hirenkyaku, blue Reishi lighting the air for a sparse moment before flickering out of existence. Only Waiwak and Hashwalth remained. The Suteiko stepped out from behind his desk and without words, the 2 opposing forces moved in a blur of motion to one of the abandoned areas of Soul Society, one that had been set aside for this battle. There were even seals in place to minimize the damage to nearby life forms. With a hiss of steel, the Quincy King drew his sword, the elegant blade catching on the early afternoon light and the long shadows of the clearing. Mirroring the motion, the Suteiko drew his Zanpakuto fire crackling into existence. Zanjitsu slid silently from its sheath to rest easily in Ichigo's hand as he studied Hashwalth, who stared straight back at him, icy blue eyes cunning and fierce with the same measure of loyalty Kojiro held for Yamamoto. With the rustle of a breeze, the Suteiko and Waiwak clashed in a brilliant screech of steel and flash of sparks. Zanjitsu snapped up to block Hashwalth's blade, the 2 quickly disengaging before Ichigo stepped forward and they moved in a blur of Reisu. The orange-haired Shinigami ducked an overhead swing and followed with a jab aiming for the blonde's torso. Hashwalth easily sidestepped the attack and pivoted, letting his blade fly towards Ichigo's neck. The orange-haired Shinigami let Zanjitsu snap up to catch the blade, and as the 2 grappled for a moment Ichigo was peripherally aware of the Suteiko battling Waiwak, Kojiro fighting beside the old man. Up, down, over, Under, Ichigo settled into the familiar dance, concentrating his focus on the battle even as the air whipped from bitingly cool to blisteringly hot, and Haschwalth fought with the same measure of skill. The two were forced to pause as the Suteiko released his Shikai, a wave of heat sweeping through the air at the same moment as that grin decorated the Quincy King's features once more. Something tugged at the back of Ichigo's mind, something vague and screaming, and suddenly he needed to get past Haschwalth, because if he could he wouldn't let the old man die by Waiwaka's hands. As if sensing Ichigo's resolve, Haschwalth turned and the two clashed in a fierce tangle of blades even as fire rent the air, sizzling the earth around them and leaving smoke upon the sky. Wordlessly Zanjitsu split into its Shikai form, the feeling of the dual blades, the differing weight, comforting in Ichigo's hands even as Haschwalth materialized his shield, and Ichigo resisted the urge to curse because the man's balance was annoying. Gathering his Reisu, Ichigo channeled the crimson-tinged Reisu along the blade, and as Haschwalth spun away from an overhead assault, Ichigo released the Getsuga Tensho. Haschwalth turned and caught the force of Reisu against his shield, crystal and blue eyes widening in surprise as he was forced to sink to his knees to take the weight of the Reisu bearing down upon him even as he absorbed it into his shield. Ichigo activated his Iero, straying from using his Quincy bloodline, as the blonde flickered in a flash of Hirin Kyaku and reappeared behind Ichigo. A Getsuga Tensho burst from the shield, a cascade of blue and white Reisu as the orange-haired Shinigami whipped around and caught the force of his own attack on the X formation of Zanjitsu. The two opponents paused as the Suteiko's Reisu rose like the crescendo in a concerto, and with a final rise, the old man released his Bankai. At the same moment, Waiwaka's Reisu also rose, swirling around the man like a thick cloak of night. The charred corpses of the slain Quincy crawled up from the soil, the very sky seeming to bleed crimson as the inferno raged around them. Haschwalth stared for a moment at the Suteiko's Bankai before something like horror eclipsed his eyes, then it was gone under the force of the man's apathy. Waiwaka meanwhile was laughing, the sort of laughter that burrowed itself deep inside of Ichigo's bones like termites, spreading and echoing around his head in a familiar flashback. The corpses surged towards Waiwaka, and as Ichigo prayed the old man had activated the fusion, the warning bells inside his mind seemed to blare louder. Zanjitsu snapped up as the brunt of Haschwalth's not inconsiderable strength once more bore down on him. It was hard to fight the blonde Quincy due to the nature of his power and his immense skill with the blade. If Ichigo cut him, the man could just balance his misfortune and turn the wound onto Ichigo. The only means to defeat the blonde was an attack that fully incapacitated Haschwalth, which with his skill was a bit difficult. In the hemmed-in space Yamamoto's Bankai had created, they moved, even as Ichigo's eyes darted to the Suteiko. Yamamoto was old, the Quincy King still appeared in the prime of his life, and it was showing. Waiwaka was cutting through the hordes of bodies with eyes that glowered and glowed with a hate so meticulous it froze. It was likely then the man had tried to steal Yamamoto's Bankai. While the Suteiko was slowing slightly, his movements and the strain of his Bankai evident even as the old man's strength more than combated any weakness. Ichigo's attention was forced to the battle before him as Haschwalth appeared in front of him. Icy blue eyes narrowed in thought, likely trying to identify a pattern in Ichigo's sword technique. The orange-haired Shinigami wished the man luck, considering his teachers, all of them were complete and utter tricky bastards who had a wide variety of techniques and styles. The moment of distraction was costly. Ichigo's attention darted to the Suteiko as Waiwaka closed in, his blade moving for the kill in what felt like slow motion only for Kojiro to appear. The elder Shinigami took the blade through his stomach, blood painting the air in an arc of crimson even as the elder gentleman grinned, blood staining his lips. Waiwaka scowled and slid his blade out of Kojiro, regarding the man in the same way someone would regard an ant, utterly insignificant. Ichigo darted to Kojiro in a mix of Shunpo and Sonito so fast that there was no trace of his movement except for the stirring of the grass. Quickly Ichigo moved Kojiro out of reach, applying pressure to the wound even though he knew it would likely be fatal. He pressed the alert medic button on his Denrai Shinki and pressed the communication device into Kojiro's hands, the other hand applying a quick healing Kido. The orange-haired Shinigami smiled sadly at the elder man before he was forced to whip around. Zanjitsu interlocked in his hands against Haschwalth's blades even as past the blonde he could see Waiwaka and Yamamoto fighting in an inferno of fire and Reisu. Channeling his Reisu in a desperate need to give Kojiro space and a chance to reach the Suteiko, Ichigo released a large Getsuga Tensho, the crimson-tinged Reisu seeming to merge with the sky as Haschwalth was unable to grab his shield and was forced back. Ichigo moved forward to stand beside the Suteiko. He could bear the heat, but just as he was within throwing distance, Hashwalth reappeared, a light in his eyes that Ichigo translated as intrigued and determined. They clashed, blades sparking and whipping through the air like liquid as they moved back in force, and Ichigo's eyes tracked the Suteiko's slowing movements. The orange-haired Shinigami knew that the old man was likely grieving as well, for his lieutenant and for the past that had come back to haunt him, even as the old man continued to fight, eyes blazing. Yamamoto knew that if he fell, Ichigo could carry on the fight, that he wouldn't let Soul Society fall. But the old man would defeat Waiwak if he was able, and if the blood dripping from the elegant white uniform was any indication, the old man was still powerful. Ichigo darted around Hashwalth, trying to draw closer as he watched Waiwak get nearer and nearer, Kojiro's presence steadily fading even as another weak presence drew closer to the clearing, a healer. Clenching his teeth, Ichigo threw himself into the fight against Hashwalth, pushing the blonde to his limit as they drew closer to the Suteiko and Yamamoto, the very force of their blows stirring the wind. In one moment, the Suteiko seemed to stumble and Ichigo's breath caught. He couldn't let it happen again, damn it. Couldn't appear only at the last minute, far too late. Kojiro dead, Yamamoto dead, and Waiwak grinning that grisly smile. Once more, the orange-haired Shinigami combined Sonito and Shunpo, moving across the battlefield and releasing a Getsuga Tensho at the same time, even as everything seemed to slow, and every inch felt like a kilometer. In one swift movement, Waiwak stabbed his blade through the Suteiko's heart, the other hand halting the force of the Getsuga Tensho. The old man grasped at the blade, eyes wide beneath bushy brows before they flickered to Ichigo. The orange-haired Shinigami muffled a cry. Instead of murmuring the old man's name softly, the words carried by the breeze as the Suteiko stepped away from the blade and stepped once towards Ichigo before sinking to his knees. Eyes that had burned like a hearth, warm and welcoming, faded, and with it the Suteiko commander of the Godai 13 died. Ichigo's Reisu snapped for a moment, whirling around him like a torrent as his heart stuttered. He had failed the old man. But he would make sure they would have a body to bury, and Kojiro could still have a chance to live. Resolution burning, reminiscent of Yamamoto's Bankai, Ichigo stepped forward, Reisu flowing through his veins and around him, touching the earth and glowing in his eyes. He moved out of the clearing to another, and in the next moment Waiwak and Hashwalth were there as well. Waiwak turned to him, victory glowing upon his features, accompanied by an interest that played upon the man's features harshly in the afternoon light. The Quincy King regarded Ichigo for a silent moment before his lips curled into a wide grin and he greeted, "Ichigo. Kurosaki, well met." Ichigo stiffened for a moment at the mention of his old name before he let a broad grin slip onto his own features, challenging and channeling Shiro. He had predicted the likelihood of Waiwak, omniscient even before devouring the Soul King, knowing of his time travel. But that meant nothing, seeing the future that Ichigo was from, a future, one of many that would never occur, wasn't going to stop Ichigo. He was going to kill the bastard and end the war, because damn it, he was not going to lose anyone else. "It's Shiba actually," he replied, because he hadn't been Kurosaki in a while. He wasn't that teenager anymore. Ichigo's Reisu flared and he gathered it around him like a cloak, letting the true weight of it reveal itself as he shifted Zanjutsu. Waiwak hummed, and in the blink of an eye, he was in front of Ichigo. Zanjutsu caught his blade with ease, and before the man could move away again, Ichigo released a Getsuga Tensho. The Reisu roared across the space between them and forced Waiwak back. Even as the Quincy King recovered, Ichigo ducked under Hashwalth's blade, and when the man aimed overhead, Ichigo released a Siro, the red Reisu glinting in the air as Hashwalth caught the attack on his shield. A small crack splintered the heavy shield and the blonde's eyes widened even as the orange-haired Enigma ducked under Bok's blade and whipped around, their blades clashing in a flurry of sparks. I had wondered who brought the changes to Soul Society, who seemed to appear in near every timeline. But it was always you, I suppose. Waiwak stated idly, as if they were conversing over wine and not battling to the death. Ichigo grinned, revealing a tiny bit in the freedom of fighting with his power unbound, even as he responded with a shrug as if to suggest it was all natural. Waiwaka's eyes narrowed, and before the man could prepare, Ichigo released another Getsuga Tensho followed by a Siro even as he ducked under Hashwalth's blade. They were just getting started. Hueco Mundo already smelled like war, the scent of blood lingering and attracting vultures of all species for miles around. Explosions shouted in the distance, demanding attention, and were accompanied by waves of Reisu so thick they were visible for miles. Two forces of white, one a supposed paragon of order and society, the other wild and free, clashed upon the sands before Los Noches under the watchful eyes of the moon above. Neliel crossed her arms over her chest as she gazed at the vast sands of Hueco Mundo, a frown tugging at the corners of her lips as in the room behind her Pesha continued to yell about battle and its correlation with death, all the while pleading that Nell stay away from the battle. The centaur Espada muffled something close to a sigh at the fighting before her as she continued to track the battlefield, noting the ebb and flow in the tide of battle and the advancement of the Quincy that was continually halted and driven back. They had been preparing for war since Haribal had taken over ruling Los Noches after their war with Soul Society, and even before that the Espada had been scrambling for power and an army under Barragan. They had a whole fighting force now of trained hollows reaching Arrancar levels, as well as the more common fodder, and had been slowly recruiting Espada-level hollows. But it all did little to detract from the force the Quincy had amassed to utterly destroy Hueco Mundo. Ichigo Shiba had appeared a few times during their war councils, outside of the communications with the Godi I-13, to observe their progress. The orange-haired Shinigami, who Nell had spoken to a few times, both during the war against Soul Society and in preparation for this war, had looked tired, and the Espada could only wonder at the man's actions. Ichigo was a strange Shinigami, likely the strangest she had met: brave, loyal, fierce, talented, sad, grieving, hollow. The list went on, and Nell suspected there was far more to him than she would ever know, but she liked Ichigo nonetheless. He was fun and was always available for a game of tag. It had been his help along with Soul Society that had prepared Hueco Mundo for war. It was likely that if the young captain, Hitsugaya, hadn't arrived they would be facing a greater struggle against the Quincy. But the kid was battle smart and had a good head on his shoulders, even if he was a little nervous. It was hard to comprehend what could have been. If Hueco Mundo and Soul Society had never allied, they would likely never have been able to hold off the Quincy, or even prepare for them. They would have been destroyed or enslaved. A knock on the door pulled Neliel from her thoughts, and she turned to face the plain white door, her hand resting on the pommel of her Zanpakuto as she nodded to her Fraxion. Dondokaka glanced once to Neliel with something set in the lines of his mask before he quickly shuffled over and opened the door. Tear Haribal stood in the entryway, a fierce frown decorating her usually stoic features even as an obvious line of tension set her shoulders. Neliel nodded in greeting, studying their leader carefully, observing any faint injuries as the cries of battle continued to waver through the air. "We have a situation. I would appreciate it if you would accompany me in dealing with the Sternritter V, the visionary," Haribal stated briskly, her eyes, with the same depths of the oceans, flickering to the battlefield for a moment before returning to Nell. She looked tired, drawn out and worn by the war. Neliel resisted the urge to sigh as she recalled the information on Sternritter V, wincing at the extent of the powers gifted to him by the Quincy King. The Sternritter had the literal power of imagination. Neliel nodded her acceptance, shifting her hand on the pommel of her Zanpakuto as she turned to her Fraxion and commanded, "Please go and aid the commanders in the battle." Pesha startled at her command as if he wanted to protest leaving her alone, even as Dondokaka nodded somberly, already accepting that Neliel wouldn't risk the lives of her subordinates in facing an opponent of the visionary's capability. With the bare edge of a smile curving her lips, Neliel rested her palm on Pesha's shoulder, smiling in reassurance for a small moment before her features once more shuddered to cool determination. Without looking back, Neliel followed Haribal into the hallway, ignoring the cracked walls and other remnants of the chaos that inhabited the building daily. As they made their way through the building towards the south side, Haribal updated Neliel on the situation. The visionary was spotted moving towards the south wing 10 minutes ago. So far no battle casualties have been reported in the area. Captain Hitsugaya is currently handling Sternritter H, and the last report we had from Star K detailed him fighting Sternritter O. Do we have a battle plan in place for Sternritter V? Neliel questioned as they briskly cut through an open courtyard. Haribal paused to bark orders to one of the medical hollows who were stationed under sail before they continued on. As they passed through an open arch, the female Espada responded, "His weakness is limited to his own imagination. If we can keep him thoroughly distracted, he shouldn't be able to focus on one of us in particular. Moreover, if we convince him to imagine his own death, he will die. Otherwise, we will need to be versatile." The other Espada nodded, a frown marring her brow as she considered the loose plan they had. The visionary was listed as one of the stronger Sternritter for a reason, and they would need to approach the situation carefully. As they neared the exit to the south wing, a woman stepped out of the shadows. She wore leather boots, her skin was dark, and her rasu was a strange mix of hollow and human. There was a deadly smile curved over her lips, and it took Neliel a moment to place the woman as one of the Fullbringers who had accompanied the young captain. The Fullbringer were all powerful enough in their own right, but would best serve as support fighters in the battle against the Sternritter unless they combined forces. If Neliel remembered correctly, this one was Jackie, and her power allowed her great physical strength depending on her surroundings. Need some help? Hitsugaya-san reported that you were tackling the visionary and sent me to help. If Yukio or Tsukishima aren't still fighting King, they'll also join considering their powers. Jackie offered, dark eyes flickering to the west where her comrades were likely fighting, before returning to them with something hard there. Haribel studied Jackie for a moment of silence that was disrupted continually by the sounds of battle, as if a war drum keeping the time of every wasted second. Something like approval shined in Haribel's eyes, and Neliel quietly acknowledged that it took courage for the humans with hollow powers to be here fighting against monsters. It also occurred to Neliel that Jackie and Haribel's different powers would be well suited to each other in battle. Haribel smiled, the sharp toothy smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes a little bit in a way that reminded Neliel of the sun she had seen in the mortal world, and nodded. Jackie pushed off the wall, and as one group they exited the south wing and stepped onto the ever-shifting sands of Hueco Mundo. There wasn't much left of the battlefield. Quincy and Hollow alike covered the sand, staining it a deep crimson as it seemed to spill into one another like a shifting mirage in the moonlight. Neliel frowned at the field of death before them, wishing that the battle wasn't inevitable for a sparse moment before she glanced up, determination written across her face. Sternritter V stood in the middle of the carnage, abstract creations and methods of destruction scattered around the battlefield as the Quincy observed everything with something pleased. He appeared young, blonde, and with a childish sort of face, but his Reisu belayed such an appearance, seeped in threads of something older and darker. The Sternritter turned to face the three of them, a smile that was a very horrid imitation of pleasant settling there as he greeted, "I am Gremmy the Visionary. I turn fantasy into reality. You should think yourself lucky to be able to fight me. After all, I think I must be the strongest of all the Sternritter." Well, that wasn't arrogant at all, Neliel supposed with a frown, the bravado reminding her briefly of Neutra during their many battles and the treachery that had almost occurred. Haribel remained impassive, only raising one brow at the Quincy even as Jackie gave the Sternritter a disbelieving glance. Sternritter V tipped his head back and began to laugh for a moment, the sound echoing and jostling in the silence in a way that seemed to disturb the unnatural stillness, even as the bodies around them were swallowed by the crimson sand. In one smooth motion, there was suddenly a meteor hurtling towards the three of them, and three clones of the Sternritter standing before them, all parading about, declaring how they wouldn't be able to defeat the power of imagination. Frowning, Neliel tilted her head and gathered her Reisu, releasing a Siro that collided with the meteor and scattered it in a brilliant shatter of hot rock. Haribel unsheathed her Zanpakuto with the clear ring of steel and charged forward, the air about them whipping with sand as she charged towards the Quincy. Jackie at the same moment released her Fullbring, her boots extending to her thighs along with a complete ensemble as the crimson-soaked sand decorated her boots. Neliel unsheathed her Zanpakuto and watched as Gremmy caught Haribel's Zanpakuto before she used a burst of Sonido and appeared behind the Quincy. Her blade never reached his neck, but it distracted him, and at that moment a swarm of locusts materialized from the sky, diving towards her. Neliel ducked under the swarm, and as Haribel distanced herself from the Sternritter's hold, she released a Siro, vaporizing the insects. Neliel moved forward before the Siro even reached the insects, her blade cutting a path through the air as she moved towards the Quincy, and Jackie mirrored the motion on the man's twin. Before they could get close, a hail of bullets rained from the sky and their surroundings as cannons of sand materialized out of the ground. Jackie kicked away the bullets, directing them towards Gremmy, who dematerialized himself and allowed the bullets to harmlessly pass through both himself and his clone. Once the Quincy had rematerialized, Neliel appeared in front of him in a burst of Sonido, while Haribel appeared behind the man, her sword swinging towards his neck with a song of death whistling on the air. The two Espada were forced away by the gust of wind that literally picked them off their feet and tossed them away. When they landed, a wide chasm appeared between the two Espada and the Sternritter V. Trading a short glance, Neliel brought her Zanpakuto in front of her Reisu, circling her form in arcs of green that glowed ethereally, and called out, "Declare Gamuza." Haribel repeated the motion, releasing her own resurrection as Neliel was engulfed in a cloud of smoke and the familiar form of her resurrection took hold. When the smoke cleared, Sternritter V stared at the two female Espada in shocked surprise, likely because the Quincy's imagination couldn't handle the sight before him. Neliel smiled as the chasm disappeared, and before the Sternritter could garner her intent, Neliel lifted her lance swirling with vivid viridian racew and sent it sailing through the air. Sternritter V dodged the lance, the air around them crackling with electricity even as Jackie appeared behind the Quincy, a kick aiming for his head. Hoping to keep his attention distracted, Neliel charged forward, summoning her lance once more as she gathered energy about the blade. Before she could reach the Quincy, the sand beneath her shifted until it was no longer sand, and she stood amongst a pit of vipers. The part of her that held the body of a horse shied away from the serpents even as she continued to move forward, coating her lower flanks in a thick layer of hierro to protect against poison. While she had been distracted, Gremmy had launched Jackie across the battlefield only for her to land in Haribel's water, which was tinted crimson with the blood of their allies and enemies, and turned the sand beneath them into a thick mud. A roar shook the sand, and Neliel stared for a moment in partial shock at the large reptilian creature charging towards her before with a scowl she levelled her spear and channeled her racew. With a thrust, she sent her lance sailing through the reptilian beast, shredding it apart from the inside in a brilliant crackle of racew. In the meantime, Haribel and Jackie had launched a joint attack against Gremmy and his clones. Water doused the air, swirling into existence in fierce tidal waves, and the mere force of Jackie's kicks now sent the wind whipping about her as she attempted to attack the Quincy, only to be halted by a horde of bees. Galloping forward, Neliel levelled her lance pointing towards Sternritter V's childish features. The espada closed in and let the long blade fly, only for it to be halted by a wall that sprung out of the sand. Neliel leapt over the sand and rematerialized her lance, continuing towards the Quincy as Haribel wielded her large blade against Sternritter V, water, and racew clashing in midair while Jackie dealt with the man's clone. While the Quincy was distracted with Haribel, Neliel released her lance, the spear hurtling through the air and crackling silently with racew. The Quincy noticed the blade only at the last moment, but before it could pierce his skin it began to glitter like diamond, and the lance bounced forcefully off of the Quincy but did not cut him. As soon as the diamond-like defense had dropped, Haribel swung her blade, the tip of it catching on Gremmy's torso. Sternritter V screamed at the cut, his eyes wide and hateful. He turned on Haribel and with a slash of his arm a wave of silver, boiling and steaming as if freshly forged, was sent towards Haribel. The shark espada only narrowly dodged the brunt of the attack but was sent flying backwards, missing her left arm. Accompanied the screams of rage as the very sky seemed to churn with the visionary's disquiet. Neliel darted to the other espada's side quickly, observing the wound and the burns surrounding it, which had a bubble of water over it to stem the bleeding and halt any chance of bacterial infections. Haribel was grimacing in pain, but her expression remained determined and cold as she regarded the Quincy before them. Neliel said nothing. There was nothing she could offer to aid with, and bringing a healer at the moment was tantamount to murder. Haribel shoved her way to her feet as Jackie appeared beside them, studying the lack of the shark espada's left arm with hard eyes that flickered to the Quincy with an anger that snapped in the woman's racew. A wave of magma rose out of the sand before them, and in a flash, the three split up. Neliel appeared behind the Sternritter V, and with a tilt of her horns she summoned her racew and launched a Ciro. Gremmy dodged the Ciro and the one Haribel had launched in front of him at the same moment. The golden racew shot towards Neliel in a brilliant spiral that rendered the sand like a tidal wave as she kept her horns bent and let the slip of a smile grace her features before she was focusing once more on the battle as she swallowed Haribel's Ciro and added her own racew into the mix. While Haribel kept Gremmy distracted with materialized water sharks, Neliel zoomed in closer using Sonito. When she was within point-blank range, Ryotsu tucked close to her body as her horns practically vibrated with the racew. Neliel released the charged Ciro. Sternritter V turned in surprise at the attack as it left a shallow cut on his left arm, diverted only by the grace of a sudden stone giant who lumbered towards the centaur espada with a roar. Nell scowled and with a flicker of racew launched a Ciro through the stone guardian's torso, destroying the creation. When she glimpsed the Quincy once more he was pale, the two cuts pale against his uniform for the moment until the Quincy remembered he could imagine himself healing. He was screaming about invincibility even as his eyes darted fearfully around him. Jackie paused by Neliel, the breath leaving her in large gasps as blood trickled from a head wound, and she had wrapped the long scarf she wore around her calf to bind a wound there. They shared a tired smile, and with a nod, the two launched forward to aid Haribel in dealing with Gremmy. Ceaselessly, they surged forward, cutting through all manner of strange creatures and inventions to attempt to wound Sternritter V. As they drew closer and became successful regardless of the invention thrown at them, the Quincy began to pale, sweat beading upon his brow. Neliel hardly noticed the wound on her back as she summoned her lance, she ignored the way it ached to breathe in a way that sunk deeper than her bones as she sent her lance hurtling forward only to be intercepted by a wall of cannons that fired back at her while Haribel surged forward, Jackie beside her as crimson water mounted the skies. Summoning her lance forward once more, Neliel channeled her Reisu, this time adding the new technique she had trained during the preparation for the war. While the Sternritter was distracted by Haribel and Jackie's dual assault, the Centaur Espada released the spear. It landed in the ground before Gremmy's feet and he let out a nervous laugh and took a breath to begin patronizing her before identical spears rose in a circle around the Quincy and with a crackle of green Reisu surged inwards. The Sternritter blanched as one of the spears lodged itself in his torso, the others passing through the incorporeal parts of his body. Haribel took advantage of his weakness and shot forward, sharks composed of water glistening in the moonlight above their heads as they joined the charge, lusting for blood. As the sharks descended on the Quincy, Jackie took advantage by sending kick after kick towards the Quincy, whose skin glimmered like fractured glass as he screamed. Sternritter V began to whisper about death in the cracked tones of one who stands before death and only realizes it when death itself greets you. His form began to flicker as assault after assault was launched, blood staining the sand in copious amounts, even as creations that towered over the skies and machines, the like of which should never have existed, snapped into being only to disable in a mess of screws and metal a moment later. Neliel once more launched her attack but paused as she saw what looked to be a planet composed of fire hurtling towards Hueco Mundo. Her eyes flickered to the Sternritter, who was laughing with a desperate sort of madness. Steeling herself, Neliel summoned all of her Reisu reserves and traded a glance with Haribel, who did something of the same. A golden Ciro hurtled towards Neliel, screeching through the sand and turning it to glass before it was absorbed by Neliel's horns. The Centaur Espada staggered under the power of the Ciro even as she added her Reisu and turned the attack buzzing through her veins and pounding her head towards the planet hurtling towards Hueco Mundo. With a fierce cry, Neliel released the Ciro, the green and gold Reisu twining around each other before colliding with the planet and destroying it in a brilliant blaze of light, spreading a fine layer of red dust upon the plains of Hueco Mundo. Neliel turned her attention to the Quincy, ignoring the blood pouring from a wound to her abdomen as she watched the Sternritter's form flicker one final time before finally revealing itself as a brain in a protective casing. The three of them shared a glance in the echoing silence before Haribel with narrowed eyes stabbed her blade through the protective casing, destroying Sternritter V. With an exhale that seemed unbearably loud in the sudden silence, Neliel turned to face her companions. Haribel's arm was still missing, and the burns pulsed an angry red. Though the bleeding was minimal due to the water surrounding the stump, there was a large gash dragging itself from her chin to her brow, and her right calf was a mess of scars, but she was alive. Jackie's thigh was still bandaged, and the head wound was still bleeding. She also appeared to have injured her foot as she dragged it behind her, but there was a curl of fire flickering in her eyes. Neliel sagged as the own weight of her injuries made themselves apparent and the adrenaline faded. Her back ached from the shards of glass likely still embedded there, and she knew it would be a very delicate procedure to remove them. Her flanks were mostly undamaged, but there was a large gash in her abdomen and the world sounded fuzzy, as if she was hearing it through a funnel. Before they could relax, a large tremor shook the sand they were standing on, rocking out beneath their feet before disappearing and slowly fading. Neliel shivered at the accompanying waves of Reisu that had followed the earthquakes. Haribel stared disconcertedly at the sand for a moment while Jackie stared into the distance, eyes hazed with a sort blankness that spoke of a concussion. Haribel opened her mouth to speak and she mouthed words, but Neliel heard nothing, only the dull scratchy murmur of static. The Centaur Espada stared for a moment in confusion and partial shock before she shook her head and focused on Haribel's mouth. The blonde Espada frowned but began again, slowly mouthing over the words, instructions to take Jackie to the med bay as well as herself. "What about you?" Neliel asked but did not hear herself ask, which was extremely disconcerting, but the shock was relatively numbed by everything else. Haribel shook her head, directing her eyes to the north where the pound of Reisu could be felt even here. Neliel frowned but nodded, knowing that Haribel would likely not rest until she was unconscious or until the war was finished. Instead, the centaur silently promised to send her a healer. Grabbing a hold of Jackie, Neliel ignored the lingering tremors shaking the crimson-stained sands of Hueco Mundo and with a final nod to Haribel departed to the med bay. The war wasn't over, and as soon as she was healed she would be on the battlefield again. Hueco Mundo would not fall. X. Chapter 72, Atelophobia. X. The afternoon sunlight seemed a poor reflection of the shadows sweeping over Seoul society, swallowing the Go Di-13, and in its place rose the Quincy Fortress. Those pale white walls had quickly become battle shelters, hiding soldiers from the unwary or serving as a shield. Rubble littered the streets, and the recent graduates who had volunteered to aid in collecting the bodies darted throughout the streets clothed in pale gray. It was fortunate the seals held at the boundary of the 20th district of Rung-Ok, preventing the battle from spreading to where the many citizens of Seoul society had been evacuated. As Senbonzakura swept through a wave of Quincy soldiers, pouring through the streets in a blinding white that matched the walls around them, Byakuya's eyes tracked the position of his comrades and subordinates. Around him, the 6th Division was defending the 4th Quadrant, one of the areas of battle that had been designated to his division. It overlapped a slight bit with the 5th Division, but Aizen's subordinates were more than competent enough. The whole idea of separating the battle by quadrants had been suggested by Yoriyuki, who had argued that it would provide a better sense of organization and morale while also allowing for each captain to know the location of their subordinates. Byakuya liked the plan well enough, as it allowed him to fight with his subordinates while waiting for a potential Sternritter to appear. So far, the 12th had detailed 8 Sternritter in Hueco Mundo, and 1 in the mortal world, which left 17 Sternritter in Seoul society. As Byakuya ducked under a hail of arrows, Senbonzakura swept through the air in a curtain of glimmering pink blades, and the Kukaki captain darted forward in a whisper of Shunpo to intercept a potentially fatal blow meant for his 4th seat. Lieutenant Abarai was across the battlefield, aiding the 4th Division medics in their area and setting up the med tent while also setting up a small contingent to protect the injured. Byakuya's other lieutenant, a young woman named Haru Kono, was a short distance away, the crackle of her shikai, one that was electricity-based, sparking through the air as she dealt with the surrounding Quincy. Kukaki Teiko. A voice called out among the cacophony of battle rising around them, an all-consuming drowning noise that seemed to whisper over his own thoughts. Byakuya turned and greeted the short Shinigami with a nod, one of his communication officers who oversaw updating him and his lieutenants on the current status of the rest of the battle throughout Seoul society. The Shinigami bowed, breath heaving from their lungs in gasping lungfuls as Senbonzakura elegantly cut through the air, blocking an arrow aiming for the messenger and retaliating in a hail of sakura blossoms. The messenger straightened and Byakuya was finally able to see their features. There were lines of distress tugging at their eyes and a watery frown pulling at their lips as they announced steadily, regardless of their own emotions, reporting the death of the Suteiko at the hands of the Quincy King. Lieutenant Sasakaiba is currently in the 4th, condition critical, and Lieutenant Shiba, of the 1st Division, is engaging Wiwak at the moment. Furthermore, Anohana Teiko has retreated from the battle along with Kenpeki. There are also reports of sightings of Sternritter F in the area. Byakuya sucked in a shocked breath at the report, struggling to comprehend the words that seemed to toll like a bell. The Suteiko was dead. They had all known that the death of the old man was a distinct possibility in the coming battle. It had haunted Ichigo's eyes at night as they sat on the veranda together. But that did little to subtract from the shock of the man's loss, a mentor to all of the upper hierarchy, the man who had built Seoul society from the ground up. There was also the likelihood of Anohana's passing drawing near if she had retreated to teach Kenpeki. Ichigo had spoken softly with distant eyes of the actions the captain of the 4th had done to prepare Kenpeki for the true extent of the Quincy's power. The thought of the captain, one who had treated him since he was a child and under his grandfather's care, and later his partner, allowing Ichigo to flourish once more, dying only so that another captain could fight, struck a chord. The captain of the 6th tilted his head down in a silent moment of mourning, praying fervently for Lieutenant Sasakabe's survival before Senbonzakura snapped to attention. The captain couldn't focus on his own emotions now, he couldn't grieve, he needed to be able to lead his subordinates, and at the moment, the Kukaki mask was a welcome interference as his eyes drifted to the messenger patiently waiting before him. Byakuya nodded once and commanded, "Please withhold the information concerning the Suteiko's death for the moment, it will only lower morale. The news will be revealed along with the other dead at a later time. Please return to your post after informing Lieutenant Abarai and Haru Kono of the other relevant information." The Shinigami nodded and departed in a blur of Shunpo, leaving Byakuya to return to the battle around him. As Senbonzakura flashed through the air around him, leaving in its path trails of crimson, the captain's thoughts darted to Ichigo, who was facing the might of both the Quincy King and his second-in-command alone. Byakuya would never doubt Ichigo, he had experienced the fraction of power he had released in the council room and knew that Ichigo had conquered a monster of far greater standing in his own past. But it still brushed at his senses that he wasn't fighting side by side with Ichigo, watching his back and halting any idiotically heroic ideas. Ichigo would be fine, more than that he would win. The orange-haired Shinigami would not let Wiwak conquer and destroy Soul Society once more, even if it took his own life to halt it. And maybe that was the thought that scared Byakuya the most. He understood Ichigo, perhaps more than anyone but Kaion, and knew that to Ichigo, the rest of them living didn't measure up to his own life. The noble only hoped that his Zanpakuto would beat him senseless if he decided to follow that path. Byakuya shivered as a chill swept through the air, the kind that wasn't brought about by the coming winter but by something darker, a presence rooted in something ill. Sharp silver eyes swept across the battlefield, noting the stiff movements of his subordinates as if they also sensed the cold presence drawing closer. The captain of the 6th furrowed his brow as he recalled the information they had received on Sternritter F, the fear, and he cursed quietly but furiously under his breath. The Quincy's ability to induce fear simply through his presence alone was dangerous and had the ability to render many of his subordinates incapable of moving depending on their willpower alone. Not to mention there was the man's Volstandig, which was beyond dangerous if it was released in a populated area. If the Sternritter decided to attack the 4th quadrant, Byakuya would need to move the battle to one of the locations set aside for high-casualty solo battles and leave the responsibility of leading the division on Renji's shoulders. He wasn't worried about Renji leading the 6th, the man was already ready to be a captain, had been for a long while. The lieutenant was brash and headstrong, but he had a strong moral code and worked well with his subordinates. It was likely that after the war there would be a few positions open. Shaking away his thoughts, Byakuya observed the battlefield once more, noting the fear that was beginning to permeate the air, affecting Quincy and Shinigami alike in pale skin and wide eyes. Byakuya frowned and flared his Reisu, ignoring the dredges of fear that were stirring in his own chest, pulling at his lungs and making his palms sweat where they grasped Senbonzakura's hilt. A flash of crimson out of the corner of his eye caught Byakuya's attention, and he turned to face Lieutenant Abarai, whose Shikai was already released and sweeping through the air even as the man waited to be addressed. Byakuya nodded once in greeting, and Renji repeated the gesture, a frown furling across his features and highlighting the tattoos decorating his skin as the lieutenant responded, "The temporary med bay has been set up, so far 10 wounded, 1 critical injury. Sir, there were reports of a Sternritter nearby and with the Reisu." "Thank you, Lieutenant. I will be dealing with the Sternritter in a separate location if they choose to reveal themselves. In that situation, please take command of the division." Byakuya instructed to the hesitant words, muffling a smile under icy control at the temporarily flabbergasted expression the lieutenant displayed before he nodded, familiar determination settling into place. The red-haired Shinigami bowed before he departed in a burst of shunpo, even as Senbonzakura snapped into the air and coalesced around a thorn that had been flying through the air towards his chest. In archway of a ruined building stood Sternritter F. He was dressed in the Quincy uniform consisting of overbearingly white, had long dark hair, and eyes that watched everything with the interest of a predator observing its prey. Byakuya did not meet the Quincy's eyes even as he stared at the man Senbonzakura hovering protectively around Byakuya as a fierce aura of pure fear seemed to seep into the air. Byakuya Kukaki, a man famed for displaying no emotion, not even fear. I wonder what fear will look like upon your features. After all, no one can resist fear, it is everywhere in every aspect of our lives. Some fear can be overcome through experience. Those who know battle often come to believe this. Fear that comes from reason is kind. It can be conquered. But true fear is without reason. It is not an emotion, but an instinct. True fear occurs without reason, without bounds. We cannot escape from our instincts. As Nod stated, his voice, the kind like the rustle of dead leaves across the pavement, drifted out from behind his mask, slow and like a poison in the way it burned as the Sternritter studied Byakuya. The captain of the 6th silently stared at the Quincy, an expression of bland apathy on his features pulling tightly on his control. Byakuya experienced emotions as keenly as anyone else. He simply had an excellent poker face, as Ichigo liked to declare when he was feeling particularly humorous. It was a necessary mask to maintain. Just because fear exists does not mean it conquers all, that is what bravery and courage are for. Byakuya responded politely, slipping sideways in a burst of shunpo as a thorn settled itself in the wall where his head might have been. Asnod stared at Byakuya for a moment with squinted eyes before the Quincy shook his head, the battle continuing to rage and clatter around them. Fear is prevalent always, it is part of the very basic human nature. Fight or flight, a fear of the unknown, the unseen. Humans are weak with fear, they stop moving, their hearts beat faster, they begin to sweat, but they stand still and await fear. All humans succumb to fear eventually. Sternritter F lectured with the curves of something like a smile visible in the planes of his mask. Idly, the man pulled out a Quincy cross, black as onyx, that glinted sharply in the afternoon sunlight. Byakuya quirked a brow, pretending at curiosity even as he pressed the small button attached to the hilt of katana. It was the measure that allowed for the release of Hollow Reisu within the captain and lieutenants who had Bankai. It was the measure that would prevent the Quincy in front of him from stealing Senbonzakura's Bankai. Byakuya disappeared in a flash of Shunpo appearing in one of the abandoned fields, knowing Asnod would follow after he had laid an interesting enough bait for the Quincy. A moment later, with a whisper of Hirenkyaku, the Quincy in question appeared, observing the fields with a furrow of his brow even as Senbonzakura swirled around the captain of the 6th. With a flicker of Reisu, 6 thorns shot through the air towards Byakuya. The captain of the 6th narrowly dodged the thorns, using Shunpo to scatter himself across the battlefield even while Senbonzakura halted any thorn that drew too close to his body. As the pink blades shimmered in the air, Byakuya used Shunpo to appear behind Asnod Senbonzakura swirling around its hilt. Sternritter F turned at the last moment, his mask creased in some semblance of a smile as he revealed the thorn in his hand. Byakuya darted away using Shunpo to enhance his movements even as Senbonzakura narrowly blocked yet another one of the thorns. Byakuya knew that if he was hit with one of the thorns it would spread the Quincy's gifted power of fear like a poison to his veins. Byakuya couldn't afford that. Standing a short distance away, Byakuya gathered his Reisu and while Asnod was watching cast a Byakurai. The Sternritter blocked the attack with a few of his thorns, bright sparks of blue clashing against pink before they were once more following Byakuya. Scowling, the captain of the 6th gathered Senbonzakura about himself, forming a shield as he surged forward, moving towards the thorns and consequently Asnod. The Quincy reared back for a moment before he let Senbonzakura cut into his skin. The tiny blades bounced harmlessly off of the man's blood vein and Byakuya quickly used Shunpo to appear a short distance away. Before the captain of the 6th could regain his footing, he felt the prick of one of the thorns. With a building sort of horror, Byakuya glanced to his ankle where the threads of fear spread across his ankle in thick black. The fear that swallowed Byakuya was like the sea, unfathomable and inescapable. It was the fear of the end of this battle, of the war. What the dead would look like, cold corpses laid out never to walk again or smile. The kind of fear that burrowed into one's veins so that he could see as he sunk to his knees in his own arms that of his sister, Rukia, crystallized lifelessly blank with the quiet somberness of death. Blood staining his hands, staining his veins, filling his mouth and the taste on his tongue as Rukia crumbled to ash in his hands. The bodies of the Godei 13 scattered around him, calling his name, tugging at his Shiakusho, demanding he joins them. Then Ichigo was in front of him, brown eyes that were always warm, burning with a determination and life that had never dulled in all the years he had known him, were gone, lifeless and empty in a way that reminded Byakuya of their first meeting. The haunted look in Ichigo's eyes when they had stumbled upon each other in the garden and the orange-haired Shinigami had relived Byakuya's death. Kami, he was afraid of death because of what it would do to Ichigo. Ichigo, whose hair was dull, not the brilliant orange, who would never accuse him of death, who fear couldn't touch. Byakuya grabbed onto Ichigo, the color of the sunset, his smile, the fire in his eyes and the warmth of his hands when they cupped his cheeks, and rose to his feet, breathing away the fear attempting to crawl and sink into his mind like maggots. Byakuya was afraid of losing Ichigo, but he wasn't afraid of death and he wouldn't let it claim him today. Grasping the hilt of Senbonzakura, Byakuya gathered his Reisu and lifting his eyes from beneath his bangs, Byakuya dropped the blade and said, "Senbonzakura Kage Yoshi." Reisu exploded outwards and the Sternritter stopped where he had been, closing in on the captain, and stared in what Byakuya presumed to be shock as the glowing pink blades magnified by 1,000 and coalesced into a hurricane of gleaming blades around Byakuya. The shock quickly faded from Asnod's features and he pulled out his Quincy medallion, spinning it once more and attempting to activate its Bankai stealing ability. The captain of the 6th smirked faintly, the feel of the hollow Reisu simmering beneath his skin. Ichigo's Reisu. As Nod stared once more as nothing occurred before his eyes narrowed, studying Byakuya, who pulled the hollow Reisu to the surface where it intermingled with his own and let his eyes flash acrid gold before Senbonzakura dissolved into a storm swirling towards Sternritter F. Most of the blades did little to pierce the Quincy's blood vein, but more than a few blades cut the man's skin, leaving shallow cuts. When Senbonzakura retreated, as Nod stared at Byakuya with a flicker of something drawn in his eyes before the Quincy's Reisu began to gather like a pestilence on the horizon, the Quincy rolled back his eye and with a final burst of Ryotsu released his Volstandig. The captain of the sixth size had been closed the moment the man had begun to gather the Reisu for his Volstandig, as Senbonzakura fluttered around him, a few of the blades resting against his skin as the presence of the Sternritter grew. Before the Quincy could enact the dome that contained his eyes, Byakuya activated Senkei, allowing Senbonzakura to cut him as the tiny blades coalesced and surrounded them, forcing the two opponents into a closed space. I will not kill you. Under no circumstances will I bring about your death. I will not allow you to lose consciousness or even your sanity. I will submerge you in an ocean of pain and fear and cause you to live out an eternity wishing for the bliss of death. As Nod intoned in front of Byakuya, his voice booming but still crackling with the rustles of dead leaves. Byakuya narrowed his eyes but kept them closed, trusting in Senbonzakura and his Reisu sensing abilities. It made him recall the days at the academy where he and Ichigo had trained like this. Grasping one of his blades, Byakuya darted forward in a bloom of shunpo and let Senbonzakura guide his hands as the blade sliced cleanly through the Quincy's blood vein. A shout of pain reached Byakuya's ears, but he gave the Quincy no time to react as he darted forward once more in a rapid burst of shunpo that would make Yoriyuki proud, not that that was a concern of Byakuya's. Senbonzakura sliced cleanly through the air only to encounter as Nod's hand. Byakuya dropped the blade and disappeared in a burst of shunpo. The captain of the sixth studied his opponent without eyes, using his Reisu to observe the wound even as Senbonzakura hissed angrily in his mind at the damage their opponent had wrought. Gathering his Reisu, Byakuya released Ika Senjinka, the Senkei swords lining the air around them swirled together before reforming and diving towards the Sternritter F. The captain remained alert, his Reisu following the blades as they slid past as Nod's defenses and attacked him in unison, the feel of crimson in the air accompanying the motion. Silence lingered for only a moment before there was the horrible sound of skin splitting apart. It was accompanied by a torrent of Reisu that whipped around Byakuya and tore at Senbonzakura, crying out in fear as Nod transformed. The Senkei shattered around Byakuya, Senbonzakura surging forth to coat Byakuya in its blades as Sternritter F's large hand crashed towards Byakuya. The pink blades surged forward, blocking the assault even as Byakuya darted out of the way of the attack, only to pause as a familiar Reisu made itself known standing beside him. For a moment a desperate fear flickered in his veins, primal and all-consuming as his hand reached out to tangle with the Shinigami next to him. A familiar cool Reisu washed over Byakuya's senses, sweeping the fear away with it, and his eyes flickered open to glimpse Rukia's features, knowing that the Sternritter's fear was powerless. The young lieutenant was staring at Byakuya in obvious concern, that familiar furrow to her brow that had always endeared itself to Byakuya on Hisuna, present on youthful features highlighting fierce determination in crystal blue eyes. Byakuya nodded once to show he was okay. Though Rukia's expression of disbelief belied the fact that he likely appeared far from okay. A roar drew the two siblings' attention to Nod, whose large form, something out of the horrifying tales Ichigo had brought from the mortal world, turned eyeballs melting from their sockets onto the two Kukaki siblings. Rukia winced for a moment, fear flickering across her features before her expression hardened into a determination as solid as ice. She turned to Byakuya, a question in her eyes. Staring at the Sternritter before them, Byakuya nodded. He was reluctant to put his sister in danger. He did not want to live the terrifying nightmares he had seen. But the sooner they dealt with the Sternritter F, the sooner he could return to his division or be available to help other captains, the sooner the war would end, and less would die. As the Quincy turned its attention towards the two and raised one large arm, Rukia released her Bankai, the field around them slipping into ice as a chill ghosted over Byakuya before disappearing. Rukia's Bankai was beautiful, and Byakuya would never not be amazed by it as ice crawled up as Nod's torso and engulfed the Quincy in a layer of ice so thick that the Quincy would be hard-pressed to break it in 1,000 years. Gathering Senbonzakura about himself, Byakuya concentrated the blades into a single point, the familiar halo forming around him as he gathered his Reisu and released Hyukiai Hakuti Iken. Senbonzakura roared across the field of ice and collided with Nod in a brilliant shatter that left their former opponent as nothing but ice crystals glittering upon the air and settling in the field. Byakuya allowed his Zanpakuto to return to its Shikai before he returned his attention to Rukia, who was slowly releasing her Bankai, the delicate process leaving steam upon the air as the older brother carefully stood in front of his sibling. As Rukia continued to inhale and exhale her Reisu flowing like the first thaw of spring, Byakuya's eyes darted to Soul Society and he prayed that Ichigo was alive. Fear could be all-consuming, but life was just the same and he sure as hell wasn't done living. Yuzo frowned at the seal as it finally settled into place, a wave of Kido gentle and hardly noticeable settling over Karakura, partially completing the barrier. Karin was standing beside Yuzo staring at the seal with a frown that tugged at the corner of her lips and furrowed her brow in worry. The blonde couldn't help but feel the same emotions thrumming beneath the surface of her mind as she focused on completing the Kido as Urahara had instructed her. The blonde scientist had sat down with the twins before he had left, Athena gray eyes dark and tired in a way that the man's insomniac tendencies couldn't hope to achieve, as he surveyed the two of them. Karin and Yuzo weren't ignorant. They had heard the whispered mutters their mother spoke to herself when she thought no one but Ishine was listening, the way her eyes glanced to the two of them with something like fear. They felt it as well. As much as the twins were now trained in the Shinigami arts, they had been trained first in the Quincy arts alongside Uryu. The first time the Quincy King had awoken in the early depths of January, Yuzu had shot awake, her blood vein glowing faintly in the darkness as Karin grasped at her chest. They had known then that war was coming because their mother had told them the stories when they had been small, about the war between the Quincy and the Shinigami, the quest for balance, and then revenge. Urahara had known this. He had studied the two of them for a quiet moment, something like pride there at what he saw before he placed a thick manila folder on the table. The scientist had then proceeded to explain everything, from Soul Society's battle plans to the potential cataclysmic event on the horizon, to their parents' place in everything. Karin had been near furious when Urahara had revealed that their parents along with Ryukin wanted to take on whatever Sternritter entered Karakura, and there would be one with the amount of Quincy in the town who were not loyal to the Quincy King, alone. Yuzu had wondered what their parents thought they would be doing during the battle. Sitting at home playing video games? Urahara must have suspected that the twins, even without the information he had given them, would join the battle in the end regardless of anything else. Both Yuzu and Karin had known that Urahara wouldn't let them anywhere near the Sternritter regardless. Instead, the scientist had given them the important task of setting up the seals that would prevent the destruction of the mortal world or an influx of Reisu, in case of emergencies. The man had also known that their friends wouldn't sit idly by during the war and had offered that if any lower-level Quincy accompanied a Sternritter into the mortal world they were to handle it. The peace offering had satisfied neither of the twins when they considered the fact that their parents were risking their lives to protect their children against a foe who was likely far stronger than them. Yuzo would also readily admit that the thought of returning to an empty home, of burying both her mother and father scared her in a way that reminded her of the night by the riverbank. Karin felt the same way, though she had hidden it behind a fierce challenging glower. Urahara had laughed, the mirthful sound that always rung a touch too hollow as he flapped a fan in front of his features in that demeaning and distracting way. Eventually, under the force of their twin unimpressed gazes, the man had conceded and allowed that if Tessai reported and that aid was needed they would be able to join the fight. The answer had placated Karin, even though they both knew that if they thought their parents needed them they would be there regardless of Tessai radioing in. Urahara had nodded, his eyes straying to the manila folder for a long moment before he had glanced up once more, seriousness carved in grim lines on his features. The scientist had sighed and added, "This a war that will take many lives and change many things. If Ichigo doesn't return, he asked me to give this to you." The scientist had handed over a package bound in brown paper with their names on the top before ushering them out the doorway, promising to say goodbye before he left for Soul Society the next day. The package was still sitting unopened in their room, plain and simple yet seeming to hold the world in its hands. Yuzo turned from the pole where they had stuck the seal and glanced to Karin, whose eyes surveyed the surrounding streets carefully. Letting her Reisu reach out, Yuzo found Chad and Nozomi fighting against a few of the Quincy that had accompanied the Sternritter R into the mortal world. Uryu and the Bount twins were fighting in another part of town near the abandoned warehouses. Beyond that, in the woods bordering Karakura, Yuzo could feel their parents and the Sternritter fighting, Reisu scaling across the sky like fire-consuming oxygen. Karin glanced to Yuzo, deferring as always in the matter of Reisu detection, her hand resting on the pommel of her Zanpakuto. The blonde Kurosaki nodded once in a reassuring manner, confirming everything was okay, earning a small slip of a smile. The walkie-talkie attached to Yuzu's hip buzzed and crackled before she pulled the device out and pressed the button and replied, "Karen and Yuzu reporting in. This is Tessai, are all the seals set in place?" The Kido master asked, and Yuzu could hear a dull thud in the background accompany the man's voice. Karen held up the final seal, the flimsy piece of paper rippling lazily in the evening wind, earning a small grin as the raven-haired twin shook the paper indicatively. "We are on the final seal, it will be up in 5 minutes. Yuzu responded, earning a quick reply before Tessai returned to whatever important task held his attention, likely setting up the seals. Sharing a quick nod with Karen, one that had the older twin's eyes lighting up, the blonde twin kept a careful eye on her parents' Reisu as they raced over the rooftops towards the final location for the seal. Yuzu stepped away from the seal, her Reisu swirling around her as she pressed the center, another wave of Reisu rippling with the feel of Kisuk's cool presence, and Tessai's calm swept over the area. Her hand paused where it was outstretched as she detected a sudden burst of Reisu from where their parents were fighting. It wavered, something like a distress single in her mind, and her eyes flickered to the battle in sudden worry. Chad and Nozomi were finishing their battle, Uryu and the Bount twins were delivering their captives to the Shoten, so Yuzu didn't hesitate to toss the walkie-talkie to her sister and silently command, "Contact Tessai, tell him the seals are up and that we're going to help against our." Karen blanched for a moment, her own gaze darting towards the forest bordering Karakura before she nodded, her lips settling into a thin line as she clenched her hand against the walkie-talkie before opening the channel. Yuzu directed her focus towards the area where Ryukin, Ishine, and Masaka were fighting, wondering sullenly if during the process of activating the seal she had missed something potentially life-threatening. Yuzu scowled when she could only faintly sense the condition of the battle, even as Karen stepped up beside her and passed the walkie-talkie, her expression suggesting that Tessai had disagreed with their decision, but the man wasn't there, and they didn't need the twins elsewhere. Yuzu took the walkie-talkie back, and with a nod, they appeared on the nearby roof in a flash of shunpo before continuing towards the battlefield. The smell of smoke grew stronger as they drew closer, and Yuzu could spot the flicker of flames on the horizon, though it seemed to be contained to the area that had been sealed for the battle, which was a relief. Karen crouched in a nearby tree just outside of the seal, and Yuzu landed beside her, studying the seal for a moment before she pressed her hand to it and whispered the incantation that would allow them to slip through without disturbing the seal. It was one that was likely complex enough for most Shinigami to be unable to bypass it, but Kisuke had left his notes out for a reason, and Yuzu was a quick study. Together the twins slipped through the barrier, a thin blue membrane appearing along with the feel of water sliding down her spine before they were clear. Instantly, the sounds of battle became louder, and the twins followed the sound, darting through the forest as if they were playing tag with Yuryuki again. The closer they drew to the fight, the more their surroundings began to show obvious signs of battle. There were whole trees felled and lying on the ground, bullet holes that tore through earth and plant alike, and a thick scent of fire. As they reached a clearing in the forest, Yuzu could see a flash of her mother's hair, the same color of her own as a Quincy arrow, materialized and disappeared. It looked bad as they moved closer. Their mother was leaning against a tree, her bow shimmering in the pale evening light even as blood trickled from a head wound, and she gasped for breath as her eyes tracked their opponent. Ryukin stood still, half cloaked in shadows at the end of the clearing, even as the twins could see the man's exhaustion like a physical burden as their uncle launched arrow after arrow. Ishine was fighting in close combat with the Sternritter R, Injutsu sending waves of fire that slammed harmlessly against the man's blood vein as the Quincy disappeared in a burst of Hirin Kyaku, only for his gun to be caught on Injutsu broad edge. Their father was also clearly injured, blood dripping from his torso in a way that was evident as he shielded that side, even though Yuzu concluded it was likely he had cauterized the wound with his Zanpakuto to prevent blood loss. Sternritter R, on the other hand, hardly looked winded. There was a cut on his cheek, and perhaps underneath the folds of his uniform, but overall the man clearly held the upper hand. The twins traded a glance, looking at each for a moment in inaudible conversation, questioning whether they intervened or allowed the battle to play out until their parents needed them. In the second they had looked away from the battle, the Sternritter had fired a Heiligfehl at their mother. Masaki, who was standing only with the aid of the tree, obviously wouldn't have been able to move in time. In her place stood Ishine, a hole in his lower abdomen, likely in an area that wouldn't do critical damage, that is if Ishine was using the knowledge he had gained as a doctor. Immediately, the twins dropped from their perch in the trees to land in front of the Sternritter. They knew that their family behind them could keep fighting, but Yuzu and Karen were fresh, and it was far more important that Ishine received healing. Yuzu glanced once over her shoulder once to Ryukin, who was staring at the twins with narrow eyes that darted around as if expecting his son to appear from the foliage, before landing on Masaki, who was hunched over Ishine. The older Quincy nodded once in understanding, moving to transport their parents away, and Yuzu returned her attention to their opponent. Sternritter R studied the two of them with eyes narrowed behind the lens of his glasses before he questioned in general curiosity, "Is Soul Society sending children to fight their battles now?" Karen bristled at the perceived insult to her person, even as Yuzu only shook her head and with a smile summoned her Quincy bow, the blue Reisu luminescent in the dawning dusk. The Quincy's eyes widened at the sight of her Quincy bow even as Karen drew her Zanpakuto. The blonde twin shared a quick glance with her sister as the Sternritter studied the two in silence before he lifted his guns, and in a flicker of Reisu a hailstorm of bullets shot forward, biting into the earth. Yuzu darted away using Hiran Kyaku to pause in the air as she gathered her Reisu and released a string of arrows. Karen, meanwhile, had shot underneath the storm of bullets, bringing her Zanpakuto in front of her to deflect any bullets that circled towards her. The Sternritter ducked away from the older siblings' overhead strike and in a flicker of Hiran Kyaku appeared behind Yuzu, who had already gathered her Ryutsu and turned to the man with her hands glowing and cast Shakuho. The Quincy flew backwards, the attack hardly scoring his skin as his blood vein became apparent, the blue veins tracing his neck and arms. Karen and Yuzu shared a quick glance, knowing they couldn't afford to prolong the battle. Ishine, Masaki, and Ryukin had likely struggled against the Sternritter because they were out of practice. It had been years since they had fought anything other than hollows, but that still did little to detract from the strength of their opponent in front of them. Karen brought her Zanpakuto in front of her as Sternritter R watched on impassively while Reisu swept through the air in heavy currents. Silently, Karen called out her release phrase, the sword in her hands disappearing and reappearing in the form of familiar gauntlets. Yuzu also felt the shift of her Zanpakuto, the familiar weight of the gunbei against her hip. Before the Sternritter could prepare himself, Karen launched forward, ducking under a hasty shot and letting her fist connect with the elder gentleman's torso. The Sternritter flew back only to land on his feet, his guns whipping out, Reisu discharging and gathering on the air like lightning before two bullets shot forward. Karen caught one of the bullets on her gauntlets, the strength of it pushing her heels into the earth and dragging her back even as another bullet shot towards Yuzu. The blonde twin ducked underneath the bullet and allowed it to connect with the tree behind her as she gathered her own Reisu and released a volley of arrows. The Sternritter dodged each arrow with a light fluid grace that belied his elderly appearance. The Quincy adjusted the glasses perched on the bridge of his nose and slid out of the way of Karen's kick, responding with a jab of his gun towards her torso that she only narrowly dodged. Yuzu gathered her Ryutsu and cast a Byakurai, followed by another volley of arrows as Karen shot forwards once more. The Sternritter dodged from underneath Karen's attack, narrowly escaping the Byakurai, only to have one of Yuzu's arrows pin the man to a nearby tree. The Sternritter struggled against his bonds for a moment, attempting to pull the arrow from his shoulder only to hiss at the feel of the foreign Reisu. The man turned his eyes to the twins, quietly assessing beneath a cold facade as if seeing that while they were indeed children they were powerful. Yuzu wondered if the man had made the connection between his previous opponents and the twins. It wasn't hard. With a grimace, the Sternritter pulled the arrow from his shoulder, crimson staining his uniform before his blood vein halted the bleeding. Sternritter R gathered his Reisu around himself in a motion that rustled the trees and shifted through the stalks of grass before he intoned, "Grimaniel." Reisu rushed over the man, forming large azure wings that hovered ethereally behind his back, and over his head, a halo appeared like a crown. This was the Quincy Vollständig, a technique that Yuzu and Karen had only begun to practice with Uri under the careful guidance of their parents and on occasion Ichigo. The twins shared a glance, knowing that in Shikai they wouldn't stand a chance against their opponent. Yuzu appeared beside Karen with a flicker of Reisu and delicately crossed her blade over Karen's gauntlets, Reisu whipping around the twins in a fierce wave of crimson and azure that seemed to fill the sky as the older sibling called out, "Bankai, Baron Sono Tentai Senko Jetsu, celestial bodies of balance piercing moon." A thick fog rolled through the forest accompanied by a humidity that seemed to wrap itself around everything it touched. Yuzu tilted her head as their Bankai washed over them, fire and ice perfectly balanced swirling about the atmosphere, coating the ground in a thin layer of frost even as humidity and steam filled the air. With a forceful gust of Reisu, the fog around their opponent cleared and he stared at the twins with narrowed eyes, his glasses tucked away. When they released their Bankai they held no visible weapons, and their Shiakusho faded from ebony to a cloth that shimmered between red and blue. Yuzu exhaled, her breath appearing in a misty cloud before her even as smoke curled around Karen's shoulders. With a flicker of Reisu, Karen dissolved into the steam drifting about the forest and appeared behind the Sternritter, a blade of pure fire appearing in her hands. The Sternritter's eyes widened in surprise even as he flew back, his wings lifting him into the air, and fired his guns. Karen stood still and let the bullets pass through her, fire flickering about the non-existent wounds where the bullets had entered her torso. While the Sternritter was distracted, Yuzu sunk into the ice beneath her feet and appeared a short distance from the Quincy, a gunbei materializing in her hands. She sent the blade fan towards the man. The Sternritter disappeared in a flicker of Hiran Kyaku, so fast it appeared as if the frost-covered grass had merely shifted in a light breeze. The gunbei circled back to Yuzu's hands even as she ducked an overhead sweep of the man's wings and sunk into the frost beneath her feet. Frowning, the Quincy pulled out a medallion with a Quincy cross emblazoned on the front, something like an apology in cynical eyes as he activated the device that Kisuk had spoken of, one that was meant to steal Bankai. Yuzu felt the strange draining pull tugging at the icy core of her being, the tundra of the Arctic North, as if something even colder from outside the atmosphere pulled at her own ice. Suddenly, the draining sensation stopped, something jarring welling up inside Yuzu forcing away the foreign Reisu. The Sternritter stared for a moment in shock at the twins before Karen merely grinned bright and feral and disappeared into the steam. The Sternritter shook away his shock and launched into a quick Hiran Kyaku. The man reappeared where Yuzu had disappeared, but she simply ducked as Karen appeared from the steam, fire curling around her features as she brought her blade overhead. 2 bullets exploded from Karen's back, Azure Reisu filling the air even as Karen landed and continued to move forward, prompting Sternritter R to use his wings to appear underneath a copse of trees further away. Their Bankai allowed the twins to remain immaterial as long as they touched their designated element, for Yuzu that meant the ice coating the earth, and for Karen the steam swirling around the atmosphere. Their very beings were composed of ice and fire, allowing them to utilize the element whenever necessary at the touch of their fingers. The battle moved back and forth in a strange game of outlasting as the Sternritter continued to try to defeat the twins and they in kind tried to knock the man out. In a burst of Reisu, Karen appeared in front of the Quincy while Yuzu appeared behind the man and knocked the blunt end of a katana formed of ice into the man's skull in a location that would not cause a concussion but would ensure unconsciousness. The Quincy crumpled to the ice-covered earth and Yuzu exhaled shakily as they slowly released their Bankai, her nails turning a pale blue while across from Yuzu a high flush dusted Karen's cheeks. Gasping quietly, Yuzu fumbled with shaking hands, exhaustion dragging its weighty claws through her veins as she pulled out the walkie-talkie and called Tessai. Reporting the defeat of Sternritter R, aid is needed for cleanup. Yuzu stated before she slumped to the thawing earth, keeping a careful eye on their downed opponent as Karen sidled up beside Yuzu and rested her head on the blonde's shoulder. Silently, the young Kurosaki entangled her fingers with Karen's and stared at the forest, wondering how Soul Society was doing, if their brother was still okay, if he would return. She had to hope Ichigo would return, that everything would be okay. Exhaling softly as the chill seeped into her skin began to fade slightly, Yuzu squeezed Karen's fingers and muffled the grin playing across her lips. They had defeated one of the Sternritter when their parents hadn't been able to. Kisuk was right, they had grown stronger, and they would continue to grow stronger so that they would be able to protect everyone no matter what came their way. X. Chapter 73, Gumaservi. X. Sosuke's gaze flickered around his surroundings with a cynical observation of the ruined buildings crumbling around the scientist and serving as shelters for the platoon of Shinigami scattered about the rubble. For the moment there was a respite, a short breath of pause where the air was hung with a stillness that beckoned death closer. Kyoka Suijutsu's presence rippled in his mind like the gentle waves of the broad and never-ending ocean as he tracked the various Reisu presences scattered around him. A pale gray wisp of fabric caught Sosuke's eyes and he watched as one of the recent graduates stood up, a body clad in a white stained to gray by their surroundings, in the Shinigami's arms before they darted towards the med barracks. With a minute's sigh, he ran a hand through his hair, pushing back the curls threatening to fall into his eyes as he adjusted his glasses and wondered how the barriers they had created would hold. The scientist wondered how they were doing in the middle of the Kami-forsaken war. All those he had come to cherish once he had allowed himself to make connections, he could feel some of them only faintly in the mass cacophony of Reisu that filled Soul Society, and of others, he could feel nothing. Ichigo was like the sun in the midst of it all, forced against the might of the Quincy King like a beacon of warning to all living. Sosuke almost desired to be there, to see if their theories had been true, to see Ichigo's Bankai and the power Wiwak possessed. But even for all the power Sosuke had amassed, it was a drop in the ocean compared to the might of those two. It was something he had struggled to acknowledge before Kisuke had given him that particularly unimpressed glance. A clatter of rubble caught the captain's attention and he watched in stillness as a white-clad figure appeared from the shadows of a building, a Quincy bow glimmering and zapping about like electricity. The Quincy lilted to the side for a moment before with a sudden snap of Reisu there was an arrow hurtling forward, cutting the air in half and screaming its intent. Sosuke squinted and let his katana glide through the air as effortlessly as water, cutting the arrow in half. In a flicker of Reisu, the captain of the 12th appeared behind the Shinigami and pressed the hilt of Kyoka Suijutsu to his opponent's head in a quick stroke in a burst of Kido. The Quincy slumped and Sosuke stared for a moment at the limp body in his arms, then flared his Reisu and passed the body onto one of his subordinates. As the body was carried away, the captain of the 12th observed his subordinates scattered around the area, checking the perimeter or huddled in small groups. There was an element of fear to the air around them, the sort of dread that festers in a battlefield. But beneath that, there was still the determination and will Sosuke expected of the Shinigami beneath his command. A split second and bare whisper of Reisu was the only warning Sosuke had before he threw up a Kido shield covering the broken courtyard as a rain of Quincy arrows, with all the density and mass of a fireball, collided against his shield. It would have destroyed them without it. The captain quirked his lips into a frown at the pull on his Reisu and furrowed his brow as he maintained the Kido, a pale green against a field of blue Reisu exploding like mini supernovas while the Shinigami scattered for a moment like headless chickens before forming into small squadrons. One Shinigami dashed out of the command base, clutching a radio to his chest and sprinting with a speed that belayed important news. The messenger halted in front of Sosuke and saluted once before waiting silently to be addressed. The captain of the 12th grimaced as the force of the attack from above was increased by something, his Reisu reserves rushing to shore up his defense even as he nodded with strain at the messenger. Teiko, we're receiving reports of Sternritter C at the front line of the Quincy attack. It is presumed he is trying to take the second quadrant on orders of the Quincy King. The Shinigami reported in a blur of words that Sosuke nearly toned out as he focused on the Reisu he could now clearly sense as the Sternritter while maintaining the Kido. The force of the attack finally began to dissipate. Sosuke nodded, calculating for a split second, considering the geography before he instructed, please inform the 3rd Division of the attempted attack. Additionally, please repeat my orders to the 12th Division Shinigami. They are to maintain a battle line starting at point 20, advancement of Quincy forces is not an option, permission to use battle plans 3 and 16 is active. With a nod and a grimace, the messenger darted away in a blur of Reisu, his command echoing in the Kido communicators Sosuke had created when a fit of boredom had struck. The Shinigami around Sosuke sprung into action at his words, and as the last of the attack faded away, Sosuke dropped the Kido and watched with mild interest as a large force of Quincy, all in a once pristine but now stained white, marched forward in a heavy rhythm that cracked against the pavement below their feet. A large figure cloaked in white lingered behind the soldiers marching forward in uniform similarity, its appearance hidden beneath a white cloak but unmistakable nonetheless. Sosuke arched a brow and supposed it was for the best that he was dealing with one of the more intricate and challenging Sternritter, as supposed to a captain who was unsuited towards the Sternritter C's nature. Of course, it was only chance and luck that this had happened, and not some masterminded overly complicated plan, though there were a few of those in place. One of the captains during the meeting had suggested trying to lead combatants towards those with similar or evenly matched power bases, but the idea had been quickly vetoed on the base of impracticality. Though Ichigo had looked considering, they hadn't known enough of their opponents to even try and predict which Sternritter would be in Hueco Mundo and Soul Society. The Sternritter turned from its subordinates and fixed an invisible gaze upon Sosuke, challengingly for all of its lack of substance. The captain of the 12th surveyed the division Shinigami scattered around him, those who were capable of fighting, staring at the Quincy with a fire in their eyes that Aizen had hardly inspired before landing on his 3rd seat. The young woman was standing with a collection of the soldiers at the front, and without prompting Sosuke knew she would take control of their forces with ease. The scientist unsheathed Kyoka Suijutsu with the clean glide of metal through the air and in a flicker of Shunpo appeared behind the mass of white soldiers and behind the Sternritter. The cloaked Quincy turned around, and as the two forces clashed behind the Stern Ritter, it dropped its cloak. Sosuke stared with his features carved into the blank expression of a marble statue, even as internally he did the mental equivalent of a scream, because Ichigo's descriptions of the left hand of the Soul King left some things to be desired. Two pupils centered on Sosuke with a sort of calculating intelligence that the captain only recognized because he had seen the same kind of look in the eyes of Mayuri Kurotsuki, who they had released from Mukin for the sole purpose of his insanity and ability to likely defeat one of the Stern Ritter, regardless of many of the captain's protest. Sosuke was in agreement that science in of itself was an art, and Mayuri was a deformed fallacy in all aspects when it came to such. Ah, the left hand of the Soul King, a Quincy serving to kill its own creator, how interesting. Sosuke commented moderately, observing the Quincy in front of him as he felt Kyoka Suijutsu hum in the back of his mind as they recalled the information Ichigo had given them on the Stern Ritter. The large hand stiffened, likely in offense, and two beady eyes centered on the captain with a touch more loathing as the Stern Ritter replied, "I am a Quincy above all else, and I serve Waiwak." "Naturally, or perhaps unnaturally," Sosuke replied as he settled his glasses more firmly on the bridge of his nose, feigning disinterest and boredom with the opponent in front of him to spurn fury. It was far more likely that an opponent like Pernida would lack rather than gain skill in their anger, which would only serve as an advantage to Sosuke. Ichigo, on the other hand, was not someone you wanted to anger in battle. The Stern Ritter stiffened, likely taking the comment to refer to its appearance, and Reisu gathered about its fingers, a blue bow appearing at the peak of each etched alongside an arrow as Pernida turned its attention on Sosuke. The captain of the 12th smiled blandly, in what would likely communicate itself as taunting, even as Kyoka Suijutsu seemed to vibrate in his grasp. The arrows surged towards him like screamers, Reisu twirling about them and piercing the air. Kyoka Suijutsu snapped into the air, bisecting one of the arrows and using a gust of wind to throw the other arrows off track, forcing a few to stick out of the nearby buildings like a pincushion. Pernida frowned, the expression strange on the large hand's features. Reisu gathered in the air and a large bow materialized between the thumb and forefinger of the Stern Ritter. The Heilig Feel shot through the air in a tower of Reisu that collapsed towards Sosuke with all the force and power of a hurricane. Kyoka Suijutsu snapped up even as Sosuke studied the oncoming attack with a blank expression tinted with a bare hint of amusement. The force of the Heilig Feel clashed against Kyoka Suijutsu, forcing Sosuke back a few feet, dust swirling around the area as blue Reisu furled around the captain like the waves of the sea crashing upon a shore. With a final swirl of azure, the Heilig Feel faded away and Pernida stared with wide eyes at Sosuke, who stood untouched as the dust billowed around him. Curving his lips into the semblance of a smile, Sosuke let go of the tight reins on his Reisu, allowing it to flow around him like a heavy curtain and fill the air. The Stern Ritter squinted at Sosuke, one of its fingers twitching for a second. In a movement that would have been subtle if the Stern Ritter hadn't been facing Sosuke. A line, one that looked like a cable dressed in black, shot through the air towards Sosuke, Reisu vibrating around it as Kyoka Suijutsu tensed in his mind. In a burst of shunpo, the captain of the 12th darted out of the way of the nerve, one that Ichigo had detailed in his report, a nerve that had the potential to destroy limbs and the rest of the person attached. The nerve attached itself to a building, and in a crash of Reisu ivory rubble flew through the air, colliding with the street in a burst of tile that shattered and cracked around Sosuke. When the dust had cleared, Pernida hovered over the battlefield, his two pupils focused on the captain who stood a short distance away unscathed. Sosuke studied Pernida where it hovered over the battlefield, contemplating how to deal with his opponent. There were multiple avenues the scientist could explore in dealing with Pernida, whose powers were difficult if dealt with physically as opposed to utilizing Kyoka Suijutsu's Shikai. The captain already knew the answer as Kyoka Suijutsu called out in his mind, and with the jagged edges of a smile, in front of Pernida's sight with a surge of Reisu, Sosuke called out, "Scatter Kyoka Suijutsu." Reisu washed over the area and Pernida blinked as Sosuke stepped back from the illusion of himself he had created, watching as the clone smiled simply and hefted Kyoka Suijutsu, dripping with water droplets that reflected the evening light. As the Stern Ritter created another large bow, Sosuke moved in a burst of shunpo and appeared behind the large hand, watching and waiting for the attack to be released before making his move. In a second, the arrow was sent flying towards the clone Sosuke, who raised Kyoka Suijutsu and let the energy disperse against the blade, or at least appear to do so. In the same moment, the captain of the 12th stepped into the air and lacing his blade with Reisu he bisected his opponent. Pernida had 1 second of realization, pupils widening in surprise before with a spray of blood that coated the shattered tile crimson, the hand fell in 2 pieces. Sosuke remained in the air unimpressed even as the illusion of himself studied the corpse with the light of victory upon its features. With a bubble of flesh and Reisu, the hand knit itself back together, as expected, and studied the illusion in front of it with cautious eyes before it intoned, a clone. Or a mirror. The captain of the 12th didn't give the stern Ritter the chance to figure it out, as he moved the clone forward as if to attack. In the same moment, Kyoka Suijutsu cut through the air and through the flesh of the left hand of the Soul King's pinky and ring finger. A screech of pain and rage shot through the air as Pernida shot a Heilig feel at the illusion of Sosuke, fury coiling itself through the being's Reisu even as the served fingers grew eyes and floated in the air beside the large hand. With a surge of Reisu, the stern Ritter C's special technique once more made an appearance as a nerve shot towards the illusion of himself. For a moment, the scientist contemplated whether the being's evolutionary governed abilities would be able to absorb anything from an illusion that was technically intangible. The nerves were forced away by the illusion Kyoka Suijutsu even as another nerve appeared from behind the illusion of Sosuke and pierced his arm. Pernida frowned as the arm began to compress in onto itself in a gory show of the stern Ritter's powers. Sosuke acknowledged that if the being was unable to gain any evolutionary knowledge from the attack then that was likely more than a clue to the discrete nature of Sosuke's Shikai. Moving swiftly, Sosuke channeled his Reisu watching as the illusion of himself was left as nothing but blood on the pavement. He intoned a whisper on the air, Bakudo 99 Bankin. Familiar grey cloth surrounded Pernida's large form, cocooning it like the Egyptian dead, before iron bolts pierced the fabric driving themselves into the stern Ritter. Finally, a heavy stone block dropped onto the left hand of the Soul King crushing it beneath the boulder's weight. Sosuke watched idly for a moment as blood trickled across the cobblestone and a clone of the stern Ritter formed rising from the blood. In a flicker of Reisu, the Kido was shattered by a Quincy arrow and Pernida rose, nails white and clenched with anger as the eyes, pupils overly dilated, glanced furiously around the area. The pupils stopped first on the puddle of blood that had been the illusion of Sosuke before flickering to the general area where the scientist was standing. Sosuke flickered out of the way as one of the clones of stern Ritter C shot through the air in the near direction where he had been standing, a flicker of wind marking the movement. The captain paused as he felt a cool liquid on his cheek, raising one hand to feel the thin cut that dragged itself over his lip and close to his eye. The scientist resisted the urge to curse. The stern Ritter now had his biomatter and it was apparent as Pernida's pupils widened and it murmured, an illusion perhaps. None that I cannot see through. Aizen arched a brow at the cocky words and watched in half-hidden amusement knowing that even the skill of the left hand of the Soul King would not be able to emulate the captain's intellect. What worried him, and was well hidden, was a fear of the stern Ritter's potential ability to utilize abilities through his evolution, though Sosuke doubted the hand was able to copy Shikai abilities without touching the blade itself. No, it was far more likely that the hand would obtain a mimicry of Sosuke's intellect. I see you. Pernida called out gleefully and suddenly, nerves like bungee cords appearing as if from midair on a path of vengeance towards Sosuke. The captain of the 12th moved quickly allowing multiple illusions of himself to appear and intercept the nerves, all dying gruesome deaths, while Kido sparked about his hands and he cast a high-level explosive Kido at the clone beside Pernida. Landing on the pavement, Sosuke frowned at his opponent and let himself become visible as his Reisu coiled around him. Sosuke could keep toying with Pernida, see to what extent he was able to absorb the abilities of a person, see how far his cloning and body modification extended. And perhaps the captain of the 12th would have once long ago in the middle of a war, but at the moment he had subordinates to protect, had the weight of Soul Society Ichigo had entrusted in his hand, and he wouldn't allow himself to be defeated in order to prolong a battle. Tilting Kyoka Suijutsu towards the ground, Sosuke masked a smile at his spirit's joy, and glancing into the pupils of the left hand of the Soul King, the captain dropped the blade into the still waters beneath their feet and intoned, Endo Rezumara no Kami Kyoka Suijutsu, God of Endless Mirrors Moonflower. The world around the two opponents shattered like glass and filled itself in with reflections of each other stretching on endlessly around them into an infinity far beyond the horizon. They were utterly alone in the encompassing, no one would be able to touch the two till Sosuke sealed his Bankai. It was a reflection of how he had often felt before he had met Ichigo, met someone who was capable of challenging him, of standing akin to an equal. What is this? Another illusion. Stern Ritter C questioned pupils centered on Sosuke, who stood without a katana in the center of the mirrors even as reflections of himself moved through the glass around them. The captain of the 12th smiled, something sharper than he showed to near anyone else, and answered, "This is me, every aspect, every reflection of myself. And this is very real." A facsimile of Sosuke stepped out of the glass behind Pernida and sliced a blade of shattered glass through the Stern Ritter. The blade exploded when it touched the hand's skin, but blood welled up from where the cut would have struck, and Sosuke watched as the Stern Ritter's abilities tried to heal itself only to fail. In this world of endless mirrors, one could only gain power by seeing and accepting your true nature in all its reflections. The Stern Ritter had yet to notice his own reflections lurking in the mirror, staring at their self with cruel and traitorous eyes. Reflections of Sosuke stepped out of the glass, Kyoka Suijutsu humming in his mind as they watched the blades cut into the Stern Ritter. They could see each aspect of Sosuke's personality reflected around them as one by one they appeared: his cruelness, kindness, devotion to science, isolation, megalomania. All a part of him. The Stern Ritter struggled one last time, glancing at the mirrors shattered and cracked around it as they stretched and disappeared into the horizon. Pernida recoiled at what it saw in the reflection, pupils wide and nails white as it murmured in a sort of madness, and Sosuke allowed the last reflection to step forward and kill the left hand of the Soul King. For a moment, he had hesitated, wanting to experiment on the Quincy and its nature, but then Sosuke knew himself and knew better. The captain of the 12th brushed away the shards of glass threaded through his haori and filling the cracks in his skin as he summoned Kyoka Suijutsu, and with an exhale of breath and Reisu sealed the blade away once more. The familiar surroundings of the pale broken street shattered back into existence, and on the ground before him laid the form of Stern Ritter C, crimson decorating the pavement around it. Sosuke stepped forward to dispose of the body when a tremor rocked the earth, the white buildings of Soul Society shuddering around him before a pillar of Reisu appeared in the sky, black, all-consuming, stark against the setting sun, and bringing with it the force of 1,000 tidal waves sweeping through the streets. The captain stared for a moment in the direction where he knew Ichigo was fighting before he cracked a small genuine smile and returned his attention to the deceased Stern Ritter in front of him. Anohana felt the tremble beneath her feet, the way the air seemed to suddenly spike with electricity in a way that struck at the well-contained bloodlust simmering beneath the surface of her control. In the midst of supervising her subordinates organizing the cots and preparing various medical apparatuses, the captain of the 4th paused and cocked her head. Hanataro, standing nearby, noticed his captain's actions and wordlessly stepped forward, waiting to be addressed. She knew what this meant, this rush of Reisu that hadn't been felt in Soul Society for over 1,000 years. The war was beginning. Turning slightly, Anohana spotted Hanataro, standing still and patient even though his nails were white where they were clenched into fists. Running a finger over the hilt of Minajiki, the captain collected herself and ordered, "Please inform Zaraki Teiko that his presence at the 1st Division is required as soon as possible for Plan B. Additionally, please pass along the information to the division that the war has started and squads are to move to their different sectors as soon as possible." The lieutenant nodded at her words, determination coiling onto the often timid man's features. For all the lieutenant lacked on the surface, underneath he had a spine of iron and a willingness to heal that had helped him to earn his position as lieutenant. Features softening slightly, Anohana smiled gently and continued, "Thank you Hanataro, you are dismissed. Please stay safe." With a bow and a faint curve of his lips, the lieutenant departed, disappearing in a burst of shunpo that left only a whisper of air. Turning away from where the lieutenant had stood, Anohana surveyed the Shinigami bustling back and forth, many of them equipping themselves with the emergency first aid bags as they prepared to head out. Isane stood in the midst of the chaos, coordinating everything with an even hand, directing the Shinigami to their various posts, all the while maintaining order within the 4th. She would do well as a captain. The division would survive without Anohana's presence. She had trained them well and they were all more than competent. It felt strange to approach the idea of her death with such serenity, masking the instinctual fear that pulled at her chest and dug into the marrow of her bones. She could tell herself 1,000 times over that it was part of the natural cycle, that she had lived many years in comparison to the various Shinigami who had died during her long lifespan. But, it did little to quell the fact that the nature of death was terrifying even to those who were intimate with death. But Anohana couldn't focus on that at the moment, not even her doubts of Kenpaika's ability to surpass her. The war was beginning, and she needed to be competent, so she was calm as she surveyed the fourth and acknowledged that without her guidance they would continue. Without many of the captains who might die during the war, life would change, perhaps drastically, but it would continue. A crackle rang out from the comm attached to her obi, and Anohana listened with a small frown as Ichigo's voice rang out stating the beginning of the war, directing the various Shinigami to their posts. Anohana listened to the words in Ichigo's familiar tone even as a mountain of Reisu seemed to collide with the paved street outside of the fourth. The female captain pursed her lips for a moment in displeasure, knowing there was an appointment with Zaraki that she was due to. It occurred to her then, as she stepped towards the doors leading to the exit, surveying the 4th Division in all its clinical sterility, that she couldn't leave the Sternritter alone to pursue whatever destruction it sought to wrought. Not when the 4th and the medical care it could provide would be at stake. It was cunning to go after the medical facilities, and the captain wondered if it was on purpose. In any case, Anohana acknowledged it was highly likely that Zaraki Teiko would be halted on his way to the first by his lust for battle and the various Sternritter. The doors slid open with a fluid ease that belayed the mechanics behind it as Anohana stepped out into the early afternoon sunlight. The streets were empty as if long abandoned, but the sounds of fighting were already cascading over the air, however faint. Following the brilliant trail of Reisu lit up like neon, Anohana entered a courtyard near to the 4th, pale walls rising up around her. At the other end of the courtyard stood a Quincy in a white cloak, the pale fabric near camouflaging with the buildings surrounding him. Beneath the cloak the captain of the 4th could identify the features of Sternritter D, the death-dealing, Askin Nak Elivar. Sliding the comm from her obi, Anohana quietly reported the presence of the Sternritter before returning attention to the Quincy, who had now noted her presence. A smile that was more of a leer was quirked upon the Quincy's lips as he dropped the white cloak shrouding his appearance and allowing the tart Reisu to fill the air. "Ah, I suppose you're here to fight me, Anohana Teiko, captain of the 4th Division." Askin stated with a grin, studying his opponent underneath a casual appearance of weakness. Anohana allowed a smile, one that crept along her features and chilled the air around them. The Sternritter blanched slightly before he straightened and materialized his Quincy bow, the blue energy crackling and reflecting off the pale white walls. Minajiki was drawn from its sheath with a hiss as Anohana allowed her Reisu to flow around her and drench the air. 2 Heilig Feel shot into the air, hurtling towards the captain of the 4th with blinding intensity in a whirlwind of Reisu. With a clean sweep of Minajiki, the arrows were cut in two, their Reisu exploding into the air around her and demolishing the buildings surrounding her. With a flicker of Shunpo, Anohana appeared behind the Sternritter, the blade of Minajiki slicing fluidly through the air and cutting into Askin's back. Crimson soaked the air even as Anohana flickered away, watching with narrowed eyes as the Quincy reversed the damage to his spine using his immunity, a flicker of surprise coloring his eyes. In a moment, a hail of arrows flew through the air, directing themselves towards Anohana in a sea of blue. The captain of the 4th allowed Minajiki to cut through the arrows even as she healed any minor wounds that the arrows caused. When the siege of arrows finally halted, Anohana noted a gleam in the Sternritter's eyes and let her Reisu reach out, sensing the pool of Reisu beginning to seep into the concrete beneath her feet. Quickly moving in a burst of Shunpo, the captain of the 4th disappeared just as the paved stone turned a deep ebony Reisu, sucking at the air around it. Askin quirked a brow and pouted for a moment before another hail of arrows appeared. Anohana frowned, sensing a gathering Reisu beneath the flow of arrows even as Minajiki cut through the Reisu. As the captain of the 4th touched down, her instincts guided her movements as she twisted out of the way of an arrow only to fall into the path of a ball of Reisu that glowed with a sickly taint. Minajiki attempted to whip up to cut the ball, which was likely the Sternritter's gift ball, in half only to have it collide with her arm. Anohana bit down on her lip at the fiery pain that raced through her veins as she collapsed to her knees, Minajiki still held tightly in her hands. There was a multitude of different substances Askin could have affected using his power, but it would need to be something he had consumed, so her blood was out of the question. It was far more likely he had consumed the oxygen and turned that into a poison. As Anohana attempted to breathe through the pain surging through her lungs, thinking of a way to change the content of the air and affect its molecular shape, Askin spoke. "You took me lightly, didn't you? The way I speak, the way I act. I seem like a worthless underling, even I know it. But you know, I don't think I really mind. It used to bug me something awful, but lately, I've come around to thinking that it's actually one of my good points. That's what I tell myself, anyway." Anohana glanced up through the heavy curtain of her bangs as she began to flare her Reisu, she had heard some of the theories from the 12th Division about Reisu affecting organisms and perhaps atmosphere. In any case, she maintained a healing Kido as Anohana shouldered herself to her feet, swaying for a moment before drawing on her reserves of Reisu. Ma Sternritter-san, you'll need to try harder if you want to defeat Anohana Teiko. After all, she is the best healer in Soul Society and her rate of healing exceeds your rate of consumption. A familiar voice called out, and Anohana muffled an unsettling grin as she glanced to the left where a familiar Shinigami was standing ensconced in the shadows. Sternritter D paused where he had been studying the scene with triumph in his eyes and glanced around the courtyard before landing on the Shinigami hiding in the shadows. The Quincy quirked a brow and said in a plaintive tone, "Why don't you come out? It doesn't become you to hide in the shadows." With a flicker of a fan, Urahara Kisuk stepped into the light, Athena gray eyes tracking the Sternritter with an intensity the man usually masked behind a facade of jovial ignorance. Anohana tilted her head in greeting even as the man continued to stroll towards her, swinging his cane nonchalantly, acting willfully ignorant of Askin's shock and suspicion. "Hello, Anohana Teiko. I understand you have an appointment, so we shall try to finish this battle as quick as possible, no?" Kisuk stated with a grin and a flicker of steel as he handed her a pill that was a pale lavender in color. The captain of the 4th ignored the way her instincts screamed at taking the dubious pill and swallowed it, knowing it was likely the former captain's immunity to Askin's power Ichigo had talked about in one of their meetings. A minute later Anohana was able to stand once more as the effects of the death-dealing faded Reisu swirling around her as Minajiki growled in her mind, feral and famine in a way they hadn't allowed themselves to feel for a long while. The scientist smiled from beneath his hat as the Sternritter turned to face the two, and a tense silence engulfed the area for a moment before with a flicker of Hiran Kyaku Askin appeared behind Kisuk and a volley of arrows cut the air apart. Minajiki slashed through the arrows with ease even as the tiles beneath their feet stained itself a thick black and the air suddenly felt tight as if the Reisu was sucking at her like a vortex. But Urahara's pills halted the death-dealing's effects by instantly changing the chemical composition of whatever substance or element was targeted within the body. Kisuk however hunched over for a moment, eyes screwed up in pain as he fumbled for one of the pills, likely hidden in his voluminous sleeves. Anohana stepped in front of the downed scientist and flew forward at the Sternritter, who was watching everything with calculating eyes. A crackling bow of energy intercepted Minajiki as she pushed the Sternritter back against the tiles, splintered, and cracked around Askin from the force of their collision. Reisu gathered around the man and with a burst like a lightning bolt an arrow attempted to bisect the captain of the 4th. Whirling to the side, Anohana directed the arrow away from Kisuk, who was rising to his feet, his katana unsheathed and his Reisu filling the air like the waves of the sea as he released his Shikai. Anohana disappeared in a burst of Shunpo as Benihime released a burst of crimson energy that sliced through the air and hurtled towards Askin. The Quincy stood still, allowing the bright energy to cut into his body in a fierce display of crimson even as the wound began to heal itself near instantaneously. The Sternritter grinned for a moment at the two Shinigami before he stated, "It's true that loyalty isn't everything to me. I just have a personal interest in His Majesty. Does that make it sound like I'm looking down on him? That's not my intention, of course. The human world. Hueco Mundo. Soul Society. The guys trying to destroy 3 whole worlds and create something new in their wake. Is there any other man who can claim that? If I were to let His Majesty get away, do you think I'd ever find another man like that again? Kisuk Urahara. You're a knowledgeable guy. You look like you've seen everything this world has to offer. Anohana Teiko, you're pretty keen, you've been alive since the beginning. So, I ask you, don't you feel it too? Aren't you curious to see what His Majesty is going to create once he's destroyed 3 entire worlds? If you wanted to see someone who changes the world, you've certainly picked an interesting side. Kisuk commented slyly as Ryotsu began to build in the courtyard, swelling so thickly it seemed to cling to the skin and suffocate one's lungs. Anohana muffled a smile behind her hair as she knew who the scientist was speaking of with ease even as the Sternritter tilted his head in a display of curiosity. Urahara flapped the fan in front of his features for a moment, delaying the inevitable and building tension like the dramatic man he was before he answered. Surely you know of the number 1 war potential Ichigo Shiba. The Sternritter nodded and Kisuk grinned bright and scary before he continued, Ichigo has changed the world in ways your king couldn't hope to accomplish. Then again, Jahabak is a destroyer, a conqueror, and will only create when all who opposes him is destroyed. But Ichigo, he's created an entirely new world without violence, without conquering. Then again, as one scientist to the next, I'm sure you understand. A skin frowned, something like anger curling upon his lips as he shook his head before he could reply. Anohana interjected, in the end, who truly changes the world will be decided by the victor of their battle. Well said, Anohana-san. Kisuke replied with a grin that curled along his features and highlighted the manic glint in his eyes. The Stern Ritter studied the two Shinigami for a moment before he nodded, and his Reisu reached a catalyst around him as he intoned, Hashein. With a whiplash of power that swept through the streets and whirled in their ears, the Quincy released his Vollständig. Wings made of circles appeared along the Stern Ritter's back. The light seemed to shine through the circles as if miniature halos of light as a wide smile settled on a skin's features. Anohana and Kisuke traded a short glance, one that communicated well enough their shared thoughts. They both knew that without the power of their respective Bankai they would not be able to win against the Stern Ritter. Kisuke's form of immunity only worked within the parameters of the man's unreleased power, but in Vollständig the death-dealing would adapt in a millisecond to any minute changes in the composition of any substance, rendering that weakness useless. But their Bankai both had abilities that would allow them to combat their opponent's powers. Frowning slightly, Anohana turned to Kisuke, who seemed to already know her question, as he replied, a barrier has been set up, nothing is getting in or out till I release it. Anohana nodded, a feral grin slipping onto her features as Minajiki roared happily in her mind, bloodlust clawing its way through her veins like a heady intoxicating drug. Kisuke returned the smile and stepped a small distance away from the captain of the fourth before his blade cut the air in front of him like paper and called out, Kanen Bairiki Beniheimer Adam. The appearance of the former captain of the 12th's Bankai was always awe-inspiring, the large woman towering over the battlefield as she regarded a skin with near-translucent eyes. Anohana grinned, the smile stretching across her teeth with blatant hunger as she whispered, Minajiki. Crimson seeped from the blade in her hands and into the paved stones beneath her feet, sweeping around the area and tugging at the hem of the Stern Ritter's pants. The former captain on her left grinned bright and feral in a manner that matched the intensity of Anohana's bloodlust. A skin studied the two Shinigami for a quiet moment, the tension that had filled the air along with the storm of Reisu returning once more. Anohana whipped across the paved stones, blood flowing around her feet and dripping from her blade as she swung it overhead. A skin narrowed his eyes and gathered the rings formed around his body into a staff, blocking the overhead attack even as he began to generate a large sphere around himself. They exchanged blows in a rapid flash of movement, Anohana forcing the man back with fierce strength and wild eyes, blood pulling at every movement, searing beneath her skin as the thick liquid soaked her Shiakusho and turned the Stern Ritter in front of her into a pillar of crimson. In a flicker of Hirankyaku, the Stern Ritter darted away from Anohana only to appear near Kisuke, where one of the rings growing slightly larger in his hand began to swirl with an uneven taint to its Reisu. The gift ring was released in a split second of action as Anohana turned her attention once more on her opponent, for the most part ignoring her ally. Kisuke was more than competent enough to take care of himself. It was only dully in the background as her sword clashed against a skin's staff that she observed the ring connect with Kisuke's arm, withering it with all the same effect as the hollow Baragon, even as Benihim's Bankai ability sutured the limb to life. The Stern Ritter frowned, something like fear flickering in his eyes in a way that satisfied Anohana as she closed in on her opponent, blood continuing to fill the area around them. Suddenly, orbs of a pale yellow filled the air surrounding the captain of the fourth in what appeared to be an impenetrable wall. Pursing her lips, the female captain watched as a skin turned his attention to Kisuke, who stood beneath Benihim's Bankai form. They collided in a clash of blades as the death dealing took effect within the scientist and was countered by his Bankai's nature. As the poison around her drew closer, Anohana raised Minajiki and let the blade slash through the bars, the blood pooling and coalescing over the orbs before with a final swing of her Zanpakuto the poison shattered, and she disappeared in a burst of Shunpo only to reappear behind the Stern Ritter. A skin turned at the last moment, dodging a swing from Kisuke only to turn to Anohana's blade where it hovered at his neck, a hair's breadth away. The Stern Ritter's eyes seemed to glisten in prompting, reflecting the blood around them as it dripped off her blade and collected around them. It would be so easy to kill the man in front of her, to allow the blood pooling around her to consume the body, the different chemicals hiding in wait to spring forth and swallow its victim. But Anohana waited, still in control enough to know that killing the man might only bring danger on their heads. Kisuke stepped cautiously to the side where he could regard a skin's face yet still keep an eye on his back. With a tilt of the hat still perched on the man's wheat blonde hair, the scientist asked, "Are you willing to surrender? If so, you might glimpse what changes your king or ours might make." Kisuk pulled out a small box that hummed with the feel of keto and added, "Oh, and if you surrender on the thought of being able to escape. It's very unlikely to happen unless your side wins." Uskin grinned something sharp and sorrowful at the same measure as he replied, "As much as I'd like to see this new world of yours or mine, I think it's hardly possible now, not with what I suspect is dripping from your blade, and better to die now than later." "Ah, that's where you're wrong. Ichigo's been muttering about allowing the Quincy to live, those that defect at least. And maybe even those who survive." Kisuk responded as the stern Ritter blanched in surprise at the words, as if he had expected the iron fist of Central 46 that the captain of the 4th had long become familiar with. Anohana tugged on her control as her Reisu burned beneath her skin and the weight of the blood around her became ever present upon her mind. Silence lingered in the courtyard, interrupted only by the sluggish drip of blood from her blade. After a moment, the Quincy slumped and nodded, defeat curled throughout his posture. Kisuk didn't smile, but his eyes did seem to glow beneath the shadows of his hat as he attached the handcuffs to the stern Ritter. With an exhale, Anohana sealed her Bankai and with it the bloodlust. The thick crimson liquid drained away into the cracks and crevices of Soul Society as her blade returned to normal. "Ma, I can handle it from here, Anohana Teiko, you have an appointment after all," the scientist stated in a jovial tone, even as Anohana could detect the traces of sorrow and grief lingering behind the words. Anohana nodded and stepped closer to the scientist, regarding his features in silent contemplation before her gaze drifted to his own and the words passed between them unsaid. Turning away, the captain of the 4th swept long ebony locks over her shoulder and strode towards her death with the same calm and serenity she approached a medical emergency. For the future of Soul Society and for the lives of those she had come to regard with fondness, like Ichigo, Anohana did not fear death. X. Chapter 74, Disenthrall. X. The air screamed in Ichigo's ears as he whirled around Reisu, cloaking his movement in shadows as he ducked away from the blade of the Quincy King. In a flash, he brought Zanjitsu Shiro's large blade overhead while Zanjitsu Asen's smaller trench knife directed itself towards the king's torso. Jaha-bok simply stepped to the left, allowing the trench knife to pass through the edge of his billowing cloak even as his sword snapped up to block Zanjitsu Shiro's broad blade. Flipping around as Bok was pushed back a pace, Ichigo tilted his head, gathering Reisu Asiro began to form along the horns of Zanjitsu Shiro's mask where it tilted over his head. The fierce crimson beam screamed through the air towards Hashwalth, who had taken the brunt of a Getchuga Tensho, forcing the blonde away once more. In an instant, Ichigo's attention was on the Quincy King again as he ducked under a fury of strikes that seemed to render the air in two and jar every bone in the Shinigami's body. Moving back in a flicker of Shunpo, Ichigo gathered his Reisu, ignoring the way his breathing came out in harsh pants as he crossed his Shikai blades and released a Getchuga Tensho. The Quincy King smiled, wide and full of teeth, as his blade snapped up to block the ocean of power hurtling towards him, parting it like the Red Sea around himself even as the force of it pushed his tall form back a few paces. Ichigo had known before he entered the battle that he was out of practice. Was he completely untrained and stood little chance against the Quincy King? No. But that did little to disregard the fact that no matter how much training Ichigo had crammed with his Zanpakuto spirits and the various captains throughout the years, it didn't compare to fighting upon the battlefield. And Waiwak was a powerful opponent even without the boost from eating the Soul King. The orange-haired Shinigami wasn't scared though. Ichigo knew that in the end, regardless of all else, he would not allow Jaha-bok to destroy Soul Society once more. Why do you fight so ceaselessly, Ichigo Kurosaki? And without the use of the Quincy blood that runs through your veins? You could join us, we could create a better world, one without all the suffering and imbalance, and the fear the Godai 13 had wrought upon the three worlds. The Quincy King questioned, his deep baritone resounding through the air, shaking its vibrations deep into the marrow of Ichigo's bones. Exhaling faintly, Ichigo's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists as he repressed the deep instinctual fear and hatred along with a surge of memories that attempted to sweep him beneath a tide. Instead, Ichigo glanced into the eyes of Bok, deep and fathomless, and replied, "I fight for Soul Society and for my family. The world isn't like you recall it 1,000 years ago. Central 46 has been dismantled, the state of the various Rungokai districts have improved immensely. Where there once might have been aggression and submission, we have found diplomacy and alliance. I don't want a world where the only thing in it is those who obey and are your image of perfect. I've already seen a world without my family, I won't see that again. The Quincy King frowned at Ichigo's refute, the expression twisting his features grim and hard, unlike the appearance of Zanjitsu Asen, Hashwalth masking a faint expression of shock behind the king. With a nod and a curious lilt to the man's voice, Waiwak spoke aloud, I wonder what you saw in that future of yours, perhaps the Soul King itself, or the death of everything, your worst nightmares becoming reality. Ichigo frowned at the Quincy's words, tightening his grasp around Zanjitsu's hilt as his spirits hummed a wordless support surrounding him. The orange-haired Shinigami tilted his head down for a moment, recalling the death, the destruction, the loss that had seemed to seep every memory in tones of gray. Inhaling, Reisu rising like a curtain around Ichigo, the orange-haired Shinigami glanced up at the Quincy King, brown eyes glowing. There was loss, hell, it was the end. But amidst all the chaos and destruction there were moments of happiness, moments where everything else didn't matter. My past existed for a reason, and the future will exist as well. The orange-haired Shinigami responded, Reisu roaring around his body and coalescing visibly upon the air. The Quincy King grinned at the response, laughter bellowing from his lungs as his Reisu rose in response, a thick inky substance that seemed to drown the world around them. Hashwalth on the other side of the king frowned, long blonde hair tugging at the sunlight. The translucent barrier surrounding the area shuddered, cracks appearing like splinters of glass. Kisuk had designed it to hold the greatest amounts of Reisu he could think of. They clashed in a shriek of steel, sparks flew through the air. Ichigo ducked underneath box thrust and whipped around, sweeping one leg out as Zanjitsu's smaller knife rose to block Hashwalth's blade. Reisu collided and sparked as Ichigo moved back and forth, using techniques like the Getchuga Tensho and Siro to create space between his opponents. He ducked and maneuvered in a rhythm that reminded him of being on the battlefield, where every turn there was a new enemy. It was a familiar and ferocious dance, one that made Ichigo's lungs burn and his instincts scream as a thin line of red appeared on his cheek and he scored a gash on the second in command's leg, only to have it reflected back due to Hashwalth's balance. Waiwak remained untouched, the unsettling grin replaced by narrow eyes and an expression of deep concentration. The very air around them seemed to vibrate and blur. With a ripple of Reisu, Ichigo released a Getchuga Tensho, the catalyst of power consuming the air as it hurtled towards Waiwak. Turning a second later, Zanjitsu snapped up to block an overhead strike from Hashwalth, the two exchanging a rapid flurry of blows that demonstrated the immense skill the blonde Quincy held with a blade. It almost made Ichigo regret having to fight him. Ichigo whirled away, his senses split between the Quincy King shouldering off the blow. Ichigo raised Zanjitsu and caught Hashwalth's blade on his own. Twirling around at the last moment as he slipped underneath an overhead swing, Ichigo released a Siro in the king's direction. Instantly, he whipped around the broad blade of Zanjitsu Shiro, catching the light as it caught Hashwalth's sword. Before Ichigo could continue the exchange, his instincts screamed in warning, Reisu tightening around his body as if in shock as the orange-haired Shinigami whirled to the side. Ichigo gasped as the blade clipped his side, the Quincy King appearing beside Ichigo as crimson fell from where his fingers were grasping at his side. There was a pleased grin dancing across box features only for it to fade. White began to bubble with the faint traces of hollow Reisu beneath the Shinigami's fingers and the wound healed. Ichigo grinned up at Jaha-bok from beneath his bangs as he disappeared in a flash and reappeared behind Hashwalth. The blonde Quincy whipped around at the last moment, catching Ichigo's blade on his own before in the blink of an eye he disappeared in a burst of Hirenkyaku. The Quincy King appeared in Hashwalth's place, his sword driving its way through the orange-haired Shinigami's gut. Ichigo grasped at the blade for a moment, blood pooling in his mouth as his accelerated healing attempted to work with the blade still lodged in his stomach. A future that will exist, you say? I will create a world without fear, without pain. What has your world created? Bok stated, staring into Ichigo's eyes with his blade edging ever upwards towards Ichigo's heart. Spitting out the blood pooling in his mouth and lungs, Ichigo ignored the pain flooding his system and let his Reisu flare beneath his eyes, coloring them golden. He responded, a world full of emotion and differences. Repressing a growl from Shiro, Ichigo channeled his Reisu and staring into the eyes of the king he raised Zanjitsu and released a Getchuga Tensho point blank. Jaha-bok flew back, his feet skidding upon the air as blood dripped from his blade and from a gash across Bok's chest. Ichigo breathed through the pain engulfing his systems and watched as the barrier around them trembled once more. he only hoped the barrier would hold through what was to come. Across from Ichigo, the Quincy King's Reisu rose to skyrocket around them as a frown that curled box lips stretched across the man's angular features. Taking a breath and submerging himself in Zanjutsu's presence, Ichigo allowed his Reisu to rise in response. Moving in a manner that almost felt unfamiliar and yet oddly nostalgic, Ichigo slid the smaller blade of Zanjutsu Asen into the hole in Zanjutsu Shiro's blade. The air vibrated and in one move Ichigo thrust the blade through his still healing wound and through his heart. Ichigo saw the shock on the Quincy King's features before his Reisu pillared around him a cloak of ebony as dark and endless as the night, and he intoned, Bankai Tensa Zanjutsu. Reisu roared and coalesced, breaking free from Ichigo's skin as it began to glow, his eyes becoming two pillars of light, a light that seemed to consume rather than provide. Zanjutsu Shiro's mask settled over Ichigo's features, his blood vein running through his veins where they glowed like pure energy. Zanjutsu became two blades of darkness whispering at the air as the column began to fade. Before the Quincy King could prepare himself, Ichigo flew forward, appearing in a millisecond in front of Bak. The Quincy King's blade sliced through Ichigo only to pass through pure Reisu. Ichigo crossed his blades and Reisu gathered around them in a brilliant torrent of pitch black before swallowing the entire sky with ease. Hashwalth appeared behind Ichigo and he whirled around, one hand reaching out to grasp the blonde Quincy's throat, Reisu pulsing in his fingers as blue eyes stared into two yawning pits of power. The Quincy thrashed for a moment in Ichigo's grip before the Shinigami stated in a voice distorted with the weight of 3, "Do you want to die in service to your king? Or seek forgiveness with Bazb?" Hashwalth's eyes widened, flickering to the Quincy King who was only beginning to appear from the veil of darkness. Indecision warred behind the blonde's eyes and Ichigo nodded once in understanding before dropping Hashwalth to the ground unconscious and returning his attention to Waiwak. They collided in a blow of power as Waiwaka's Reisu surged forth, instead of the inky black he paraded around with, white began to emanate from his skin, glowing from his eyes in a similar manner to Ichigo as he growled, "I dislike using this power, this side of me that comes from him. But I will not lose, the Quincy will rise." Their Reisu raged against one another, Waiwaka's shattering the earth beneath their feet even as Ichigo's put it back together again. With a final crack, the barrier broke apart, Reisu leaking out only to encounter the second barrier, which was only a temporary stopgap. Blades formed of power clashed and flickered, extending and become intangible before colliding with enough force to pull at the edges of Ichigo's form. Gathering his Reisu once more, Ichigo crossed his blades in front of his chest and tilted the horns of his mask towards Waiwak, blue Reisu coiling along his arms and forming an arrow in the center of it all. Ichigo grinned once, visible beneath the energy of his form before Reisu exploded, devouring all in its path and leaving it unscathed as it forced its way towards the Quincy King. Waiwak raised his blades and caught the brunt of the attack, even as the blades began to crack, white Reisu attempting to fight off the sheer indomitable surge of black that raced forward with the cries of all those Ichigo had lost echoing on the air. On the floor beneath them, Hashwalth rose to consciousness, studying the battle with distraught eyes. If he moved now, he could aid the Quincy King and potentially save his life. Or he could wait and attempt to reconcile with Bez, see the world this Shinigami who possessed Quincy blood, who chose to save not kill, would create. Hashwalth turned his head and closed his eyes. With a shatter like a gunshot, the swords in the Quincy King's hands broke apart. Reisu whirled and sucked at the air like a black hole even as Ichigo appeared, Zanjutsu resting at the man's neck. Silence lingered in the clearing, disturbed only by the roar of the winds caused by their power as Ichigo stared into Bak's eyes, his own two yawning pits of Reisu that swirled with emotion. Sorrow tightened Ichigo features for a moment and his hands shook around the hilt of Tensa Zanjutsu. The orange-haired time traveler exhaled once and stated, "Fear is a natural part of life just as much as love." Then Zanjutsu passed through the Quincy King's neck and an explosion of Reisu raced around them. Ichigo extended his Reisu, forming a contained shield as Jaha-Bak's laughter echoed in his ears and a jarring smile appeared in front of his eyes before Reisu erupted with all the terrifying force of Mother Nature. When the storm was over, Ichigo touched down on the grass, long green strands winding their way around his ankles and reaching up to curl around Zanjutsu as the power emanating from the orange-haired Shinigami slowly retreated deep inside himself. Slumping to his knees, Ichigo breathed deeply, struggling for consciousness at the exhaustion that coursed through his veins even as tears began to well up in his eyes. They slid down his cheeks cold as ice and achingly unfamiliar as Ichigo bent over and sobbed into his knees, great heaving sobs that shook his body and tore themselves from his throat. Zanjitsu hummed warm and sure as Ichigo finally acknowledged that it was over. There were no great threats that sought to destroy the lives of his family, no longer would he need to plan for every contingency. He was free of the weight that had settled itself on his shoulders since he was 15. There would be the dead from this war, but never again would Ichigo have to stare at row after row of cloth-covered bodies. Over. It was over. Ichigo continued to cry, salty tears tracing his cheeks and staining his hands. It overwhelmed him, leaving him defenseless in the moment as he panted for breath, his chest aching as if a heart attack. Zanjitsu remained silent all the while, their presence confirmation that it was real, not a dream or an illusion. His family was safe. A small twirl of Reisu caught at Ichigo's weakened senses and he glanced up from the shelter of his arms, blinking at the sunlight filtering through the air. All around Ichigo, Reisu hummed familiar in a way that ached. They were almost visible, faint silhouettes glowing at the beginning of the evening twilight. Ichigo wiped away the tears clinging to his eyelids and let a watery smile cross his lips at the sight of them. They faded away slowly before his eyes, with smiles and peace resting on their features as the grass continued to curl along his legs and the sun began its slow descent. Ichigo stared at the door for a long moment before he opened it and stared at the emptiness, silently letting the door swing shut with a click once more. If a healer saw him they would throw a fit, but it would be nothing compared to Anohana's terrifying aura. The orange-haired Shinigami sucked in a breath at the thought, fingers tightening around Zanjitsu's hilt. The spirit's presence remained a low hum. Some part of Ichigo didn't want to leave the confinement of the room he had been placed in amid the rush that the end of the war had brought. When it had ended, it had done so with a flourish and a bang. Ichigo had been carted to the 4th, diagnosed with exhaustion and shock, and shoved in an empty room. There wasn't time to celebrate yet. They needed to find the dead, prepare the ceremonies, clean up in the aftermath, reintroduce the displaced Rungokai citizens, organize their war prisoners, and contact Hueco Mundo and the mortal world. The list seemed to go on and Ichigo was ecstatic he wasn't organizing everything, that duty fell to the new Suteiko. Exhaling with a shuddery breath, Ichigo leaned his head against the cool surface of the doorway in front of him and resisted the urge to silently scream. Instead, he tamed his Reisu where it bristled beneath his skin and submerged himself in Zanjitsu's presence. With an exhale, Ichigo straightened, and acknowledged that he needed to go out there, to see it for himself. The door slipped open with a gentle push, revealing familiar white hallways as a Shinigami bustled past Ichigo carrying bandages and a general aura of urgency. Shaking his head with the fracture of a smile, Ichigo continued down the hallway, swaying every few steps with exhaustion. The orange-haired Shinigami paused at the room he had been in only 3 times, all equally unpleasant. Pushing past the lump in his throat, Ichigo entered the room. It was cold, in a way that instantly chilled the skin and everything underneath as Ichigo observed the gurneys laid out in rows and the pale walls. Ichigo didn't step forward, didn't peer under the cloth covering the bodies. He already knew the casualty list as if it was seared into his mind. Kisuke had delivered it while Ichigo was still in a haze, the blonde's voice pounding to the beat of his heart in wrenching sorrow with its grim parade. Yamamoto, who would never again govern the Godai 13, or drink tea with Ichigo and discuss the future and nature of justice, who would never smile when he gazed at Soul Society standing proud and mighty with all its captains and lieutenants. Anohana, he would never again be able to speak to her about what he had seen. Feel the way her healing Kido sunk beneath the skin, see her real smile or hear tales of the Godai 13 in its youth. Love and Rose, who had been found together hands clasped. Ichigo wouldn't get to listen to Love tease him or Rose's music. 2 of the Vizard were gone and something inside Ichigo ached at the thought of it. Komamura, who had sacrificed himself to fight for Soul Society with the same honor and sense of duty he had possessed in the original timeline. Jin and Rangiku, who had died in 2 separate worlds. Some part of Ichigo was happy in a dull distant way that they had had the chance to be together, to live together and reconcile with one another. Their loss still ached. Rangiku, who had always teased and snuck in sake with a grin, Jin cunning and hiding a dry humor. Mayuri, his loss wasn't particularly mourned. Hundreds of divisions of Shinigami, many of the academy students who had volunteered to clear the battlefield and recover the bodies, countless Quincy still lay buried beneath the rubble. Ichigo leaned against the doorway and let his heart shudder in his chest as he surveyed the bodies, sheets cloaking their features so that in death everyone was equal. The orange-haired Shinigami closed his eyes and whispered in apology, for those who he couldn't save, for those who had met the same fate regardless of his changes and plans, for those that would not see the future Soul Society would create until they rejoined the reincarnation cycle. Turning away from the cool air, Ichigo exited the morgue and continued walking down the hallway. A Shinigami with a tray hurried past, taking little note of Ichigo except for a cursory glance before continuing. Ichigo followed the medic towards the large med bay that served as the center of the 4th Division. Something like dread, but what was probably exhaustion, dragging at his feet. The sound of beeping and the rustle of breathing and shifting cloth made itself known before the sight of the med bay as Ichigo lingered in the doorway. He watched for a moment as the medics scurried between the gurneys, pausing every so often to check a patient's dressing or administer another round of healing keto. The room was silent in a way that didn't hang over one's head but simply lingered with the stillness of those slumbering. Isane and Hanataro were handling the division well. Entering the room, Ichigo cast a discreet keto that required little Reisu but a lot of detail. It was one that masked Ichigo in semi-plain sight. It had been invented by Kisuke, of course. Ichigo walked through the aisles, his eyes sweeping over familiar and unfamiliar features. So many of the Shinigami had been gravely or permanently injured, hanging to life with only the thread of determination tying them there. Shunsui had lost an eye again and was already wearing an eye patch even as he worked in the first to try and sort Soul Society out. Jushiro was likely beside the Suteiko even though he had been injured during the war as well, and after everything was sorted out wouldn't be on active service. As Ichigo paced down the aisle he could see Kira, who had lost an arm. The lieutenant was hunched over with a stack of paperwork attempting to finish reports. Sosuke no longer had both his ears, but he was somewhere in the 12th division, so the chances of seeing the scientist make an appearance in the 4th was slim. Shinji was still in critical condition, Hiyori sitting like a statue beside the blonde as an oxygen mask obscured his features. Swyfon had gained intense facial scarring, which would make her look badass in the years to come. Yuriuki was sitting by the lieutenant, their hands linked even as 2nd Division members reported to her. Yumi Chika was in a coma. Ikeka wouldn't be moving for a few weeks even as they rested in beds beside each other. In Hueco Mundo, Haribel was under the careful eyes of their healer, holding onto life by a thread even as her fraction crowded around her. Stark and Lilynet had made it through the battle, and the news eased something heavy on Ichigo's chest, even if the Coyote Espada only had one leg left. Neliel was deaf, but her ability to read lips and communicate through actions meant she would survive. Byakuya had lost his left hand. Ichigo had only seen a glimpse of him, stolen in the early hours, just to reassure himself that Byakuya was still alive. Seeing him alive, even without a hand, had left relief bubbling up in Ichigo's chest, and he couldn't help the way he had peppered Byakuya's face with kisses. Renji, with his head wrapped up, and Rukia, walking with a limp, had both been in the room and had made disgusted faces at each other. The injuries went on, from minor to critical, so many of them requiring intense rehabilitation or physical therapy, not to mention the PTSD the war would leave behind. It felt like a disaster and a new beginning all at once. Ichigo paused by Shihei, lying still on the cot, each breath shuddering from his lungs, and bandages wrapped from shoulder to torso. Kensei was sitting in the chair beside the lieutenant, eyes dark even as Mashiro next to Kensei held his hand. Ichigo turned away and continued towards the doors. They would recover. Soul Society would recover. The air outside smelled like ash, but the sun was in the sky, dappled rays alighting on pale walls. Ichigo inhaled quietly for a moment, letting his eyes sweep over his surroundings with a hunger as if to satisfy some primal thought that the inside of the 4th was all that was left standing. Searching through the remnants of his impressive reserves, the orange-haired Shinigami let a small smile slide across his lips before he disappeared in a burst of shunpo, slower than normal but still equally fast. Sokioku Hill was still pockmarked from the multiple battles that had occurred on its plateau. It echoed with an isolated stillness as Ichigo settled on the edge, letting his eyes sweep out across Soul Society. Ichigo didn't know how long he sat there, running his fingers through the dust and simply watching the city alive beneath his feet, feeling the gentle presence of his friends Reisu. Zanjitsu hummed in reassurance, the two spirits' emotions wrapping and mixing with his own. He wondered how everything would change now. In his timeline, Ichigo had never seen the fulfilled potential of Soul Society in all its Shinigami. He never saw Karen or Yuzo grow up, or Orium fulfill her dreams of being a cyborg chef, Urayu entering the medical field, Tatsuki going professional, or Chad's band becoming famous. Brushing a hand through his hair, Ichigo wondered what his own future would be. He almost felt adrift. No longer was there some defining battle on the horizon, or the next enemy to plot for. Oh, there would always be someone with a vengeance seeking to destroy Soul Society. But there wouldn't be something on such as a catastrophic scale as Aizen or Wiwak for another 1,000 years or so. What was he supposed to do now? Return to try and decode the tome he had found in all its mysteries? Help Rungokai flourish, maybe set up medical practices? Mentor a few Shinigami or teach at the academy? The idea of peace felt so strange to Ichigo's mind as he surveyed Soul Society. In the end though, the orange-haired Shinigami knew he would have to get used to it and that life would continue. A surge of Reisu appeared suddenly on the horizon, blaring bright and loud on Ichigo's senses before disappearing. The orange-haired Shinigami quirked a brow, squinting his eyes as he allowed his senses to reach out searching for the sudden presence. In another split second, the presence blared again and Ichigo shot to his feet as he focused on it. The presence was familiar in a vague and faded way, vague and powerful like a beacon calling Ichigo's attention. Distantly, the orange-haired Shinigami wondered if anyone else had noticed the strange presence even as his hand tightened around Zanjitsu's hilt and he departed from Sokioku Hill in a burst of shunpo. As Ichigo moved through the air, he followed the flashing presence, tracking it ever farther, past the Godi I-13 and into the deeper districts of Rungokai. In some moments, the Reisu would disappear and the orange-haired Shinigami would be forced to pause, waiting for it to appear again. When Ichigo finally landed, he was in one of the outer districts, one the time traveler had visited many times before in his past and a few times in the current timeline. The area was shrouded with forests, the foliage so thick and heavy that the verdant leaves left little sun to pierce the canopy and reach the ground below. Ichigo landed with a whisper of sandals against a floor of dead leaves as he glanced around. There was someone standing at the other end of the clearing, coveted in the shadows. The only thing visible was the faint strips of white from a Shinigami Shiakusho. A shiver ran down Ichigo's spine and trailed into his limbs as he stared at the figure who stepped slowly out of the darkness. Their hair was long and faded in a way that made the original color near unidentifiable. They had a katana strapped to their waist, plain and unadorned, and their eyes were brown. I would put brown eyes first, deal with personal characteristics then sword. The figure stepped further into the sunlight and spoke, its voice like the rustle of the leaves beneath them and aching with an age-old pain. So, you've finally come. It's been so long, but I suppose it was worth it if this is the end result. Come now, you know who I am, don't look at me like that, after all, we're one and the same. Ichigo stared at the figure silently even as Zanjitsu bristled in his mind. The orange-haired Shinigami knew who was standing across from him, loath as he was to admit it. The figure nodded its head in agreement and stated, "How do you think everything worked out so perfectly? The hollow that escaped to attack Masaka Kurosake, the labs, Rungokai, the Stern Ritter not having equal information on Soul Society, the book containing all my secrets, every timeline that went wrong. It was all to achieve this." The silence in the clearing felt deathly and stifling, choking Ichigo's lungs as he regarded the person across from him. The broken figure tipped back its head and laughed, shaking their long hair with the movement. It made sense in a twisted sort of way, one that wrapped itself around Ichigo's mind even as he struggled with the reality of it. It wasn't possible, and yet Ichigo himself had done it, who was to say? Zanjitsu snapped up to block the katana. The two suddenly screaming together with a clash of sparks that seemed to whisper in the dense clearing. The figure's blade wasn't a Zanpakuto, but nonetheless, the intense feeling of loneliness and grief seemed to swamp the blade. Back and forth they moved in a clash so blinding that the earth at their feet trembled. Ichigo wanted to yell for the figure to stop, to try and talk, but there was no time in the furious dance. Colliding heavily with the earth, Ichigo rolled to his feet as the Shinigami hovered a few feet away. At that moment, something like ice and the tundra flared in Ichigo's right sleeve and his eyes widened in realization. Reaching subtly into his sleeve, Ichigo pulled out the thin needle the Soul King had gifted Ichigo what felt as if 1,000 years ago. Suddenly its purpose made sense and Ichigo struggled to his feet and in a burst of Hirin Kyaku appeared in front of the figure. Brown eyes widened in surprise and acceptance as pale fingers wrapped around Ichigo's own and allowed the needle to pass through the figure's chest and into their heart. With a bloody grin the figure coughed and stated, "Take care of the future, don't waste it," and shattered in a burst of blue rays. The particles drifted through the air before floating upwards through the thick foliage and disappearing against the endless sky. The needle in Ichigo's hand shattered into dust before blowing away in the wind, and Ichigo slumped to his knees wondering if it had all been real or a strange dream. X. Chapter 75, Quietus. X. Ichigo let his eyes drift over the white walls surrounding him as he strolled through the Godai 13 at an idle pace. Shinigami passing by bowed briefly before continuing on with whatever assignment their vindictive captains had assigned them. It was funny how things changed and yet stayed the same. It was all so different now: Soul Society, the mortal world, Hueco Mundo, the future. And yet some things were still the same as 1,000 years ago. Shunsui, from the moment they started to resurrect Soul Society from the ashes, had implemented changes, allowing for Soul Society to flourish and prosper in a way it hadn't for years, stuck in a period of endless stagnation. He had opened Soul Society's eyes to the mortal world and the multitude of advancements humanity had made, while also allowing tradition to remain. Soul Society wasn't some utopia of the future. For the most part, it still appeared they were stuck in the Edo period, but every now and again you could see some modern architecture creeping in, and the houses were definitely built better. Hospitals had opened to provide new medicine, more than a few in Anohana's honor, restaurants adapted to new sanitary policies, and there was even a small form of inter-district politics and democracy happening. The changes to Soul Society weren't just related to Rungokai. The Godai 13 after the war had seen a shuffle, lieutenants moving around, some being promoted, some captains retiring. Jushiro had retired from active service and now served as an advisor to Shunsui, which basically meant the white-haired man stopped all of the drunk Suteiko's more ridiculous plans. Rukia had stepped into the position as captain of the 13 officially, though it was generally agreed by everyone that Kyan served more as a co-captain than a lieutenant. Everyone also conveniently ignored when the smaller captain disappeared for a week on a visit to the mortal world. Kyan was happy enough that he was technically still serving under Jushiro. Kojiro had retired after aiding in the cleanup and for the most part, spent his time at the academy teaching the students the art of chivalry and kendo. Isane was doing well as captain of the 4th with Hanataro as her lieutenant. Yuzo was usually there along with Uriu at least once a week, updating the sometimes timid women on the various medical updates so they could improve the 4th. Lisa and Nano had happily taken over the 8th and turned it into a squad dedicated to female empowerment and representation in Soul Society, which always made Ichigo grin. Yumi Chika of all people had taken over Rose's division, continuing the trend of focusing on embracing the beauty in music, art, fashion, and all forms of expression. It made sense in a strange sort of way. Love's division still needed a captain, but for the moment Renji, Kira, and Shihei rotated the position every few months, which led to some very different tactics and experience for the 3 likely candidates. Hueco Mundo, for the most part, had sorted itself out. Shunsui still kept correspondence with Haribal for the simple reason of diplomacy, but both sides were content to leave each other alone. Or at least that was the facade. In truth, the Espada liked to pop into Soul Society whenever to say hello or challenge someone to a duel that would blow up half the street, and they would laugh about it afterwards. Ichigo wasn't really sure where he fit into the system, as he no longer was a captain or a lieutenant but was treated with the same respect. As Ichigo continued to walk the streets of Soul Society, he supposed he was more like an advisor. He floated around and aided people when necessary. It was who he was, past, present, and future. X. So, you see, class, the Greeks were divided in a sense much like one might consider the different division. Each city had its own identity, culture, and religion, which was woven and interconnected with the Greek culture. This divide was part of the problem in the civil war between Athens and Sparta. Think about divide and differences. How do they affect Soul Society as well as the 3 worlds? We have differences in culture and tradition, but also in development. Mortals have less time, so they live life vibrantly, they live life to the fullest. Shinigami take their time to mature and are often set in their ways. Hollows often live their lives feeling empty and searching. Think about your own differences and look around. It's from the differences of others that we find a greater whole. Ichigo finished with a shine to his eyes and a smile as he studied the bright eyes staring back at him and around them. Something about providing knowledge and seeing it comprehended was inherently amazing. The Shinigami began to chatter softly in the warm sunshine, comparing differences between the Shinigami but also other branches. "Shiba-sensei?" a voice cautiously asked, interrupting the teacher's piece where he leaned against the tree nonchalantly, an English text held in his hand. Ichigo's students were gathered around him, settled on the grass in comfortable positions, but their focus resettled on the orange-haired Shinigami at the question. Ichigo nodded at the student, one from the class that he taught every Wednesday, whose name the orange-haired Shinigami was pretty sure was Shimura. "You promised you would tell us about your experiences in America with their mythology after our lesson today," Shimura stated with a pleading tone, and suddenly 20 hopeful eyes swung his way with all the blinding force of the sun. Ichigo pretended to think for a long moment, grinning evilly internally all the while. His class was listed as open and generally didn't follow a curriculum, but those who took Ichigo's class were bound to learn strategy, the art of planning and manipulation, the occasional sword technique, how to prevent the world from ending through the use of diplomacy, and a hell of an interesting perspective. They also learned more about the famous savior of Soul Society, though he preferred Ichigo. Ichigo waited a moment more, enjoying the anguish on their features before he finally relented with a laugh and began. "At one point in the war we were worried about Waiwaka's influences spreading around the world, and we were in a bit of a lull then. The stones were well polished, they almost gleamed in the early morning light." Ichigo sipped at the tea he had brought in a thermos and remembered the Suteiko's smile, Anohana's kind eyes. He recalled Love and Rose's acceptance, the way they seemed to move together to some invisible rhythm. Ichigo remembered and smiled. "No throwing dinner. That means Yukian, and I see you as Heinji. I put the rice down this instant. Ichigo and Yuza worked hard on this dinner and no one is throwing anything, not even shade. We are having a nice family dinner and this decision is final." Kyokako lectured from her rightful position at the head of the table, slamming her wooden hand down for good measure and adding a gunmetal glare for potency. Kion pouted like the man-child he was, but put the bowl he was holding down even as his hind shot an evil glare at the head of the Shiba clan. Masaka beside her husband muffled her smile in the palm of her hand, her features glowing with happiness even as small wrinkles made themselves visible in a stunning way. She winked quietly at Ichigo in that knowing way that suggested tolerance on both their parts, even as she comforted her husband with a light pat on his arm. Karen was studying the two Shiba men with shifty eyes even as she listened to Yuzo continue her tale of how she had met her new girlfriend. It was certainly interesting. Ganju on the other side of Yuzo was listening with bright eyes even as he shifted, waiting to tell his story about the Rungokai brats he was mentoring. Ichigo nodded his thanks to his older sister, earning a cocky wink and a smile that was all love. Taking another bite of the delicious meal, Ichigo glanced at his sisters. He couldn't believe how they were so grown up. Tall and with matureness shaping their features, he had been able to watch their passions flourish, and learn their new favorite songs and food. Karen was entering the pro soccer field soon, and Yuzo was entering college for nursing in a year. They were so bright and happy it made his chest hurt a bit at the weight of the emotions. It was a good sort of pain though. Kion on Ichigo's right gently tapped his elbow against Ichigo's, and when he had gathered the orange-haired Shinigami's attention he nodded once in understanding, silver eyes serious. Ichigo smiled faintly and pointedly said, "I see the Katsudan in your hands, Kion." The eldest Shiba sibling pouted and the table erupted into laughter once more. Light chatter filled the night as they traded stories and continued to yell at certain ridiculous Shiba men. The bar was dim and smoky, but Shinji looked in his element, squished in the booth with Hiyori frowning beside him, and Kisuke on the other side. Ichigo shook his head and slid into the booth beside Lisa. Yoriyuki winked at the orange-haired Shinigami over her drink where she was curled beside Kisuke, and Mashiro bounced and waved while Kensei sighed in resignation. Ichigo muffled a smile at the sight of the Vizard together. The missing presences of Rose and Love were sharp and painful, hanging over all their heads unspoken, just like the record tucked in the corner of the booth. But they were celebrating the lives Rose and Love had lived. They had laughed with them for years, and while they were mourning, it wasn't as heavy as that first time meeting as a group again after the war. Lisa curled an arm around his shoulder and slid a drink his way. Steam curled in gentle spirals from the mug, and Ichigo rolled his eyes but took a sip of the sake. Lisa grinned bright and real in the moment in a way that was hard to pull apart. The orange-haired man felt Shinji's concerned eyes before he saw them, the way the blonde was locked onto Ichigo even as he bickered idly with Hiyori. The captain of the fifth raised one brow in question, concern lacing his features like a well-greased motor. Ichigo smiled in a reassuring manner and the blonde's shoulders untensed before he returned his attention to the smaller blonde batting at his shoulder. "Any Ichi?" Mashiro called over the table in a yell that was probably too loud for the small restaurant. Ichigo turned his head and nodded at the childish wizard who beamed and stated, "Kensei agreed to let me be co-captain." "I did not." Kensei retaliated a moment later and the table descended into chaos over whether Mashiro or the division would ever actually survive as a captain. Ichigo smiled and leaned against the booth absorbing the warmth of his chosen family, even if they were different from what they all started as. Ichigo slipped out from underneath Byakuya's arm and the warm comforter that prevented the chill of the night from seeping into their skin. The orange-haired Shinigami sat on the edge of the futon for a moment, watching the way the moonlight caught at Byakuya's hair and highlighted the peace of his expression. Shaking fingers clenched the blankets for a moment as Ichigo exhaled shakily, drawing on Zanjutsu's presence to relax tightly coiled muscles. Stepping onto the cool floor, Ichigo muffled a curse into his sleeve and opened the shoji door, stepping onto the veranda with the lightest whisper of movement. The sky spread out before him in blossoming shades of fiery orange and deep blue that danced together to form 1,000 shades. Puffy clouds still lingering with the darkness of night floated gracefully, and on the horizon the sun began to crest the hill, golden rays spilling across the land. Ichigo exhaled and knew it would be all right. The end. Check the description for the links to the author.